Chapter 1. The ring after midnight rain stitched silver lines across Riddle Street when the story began with a dead man's voice. 3 people swore that Elias Vane had called them after midnight, each hearing the same calm breath between words, the same warning not to come looking for him. By dawn, Elias was already lying cold in a locked print shop. The clock on the wall stopped at 11:17. Wolf stood beneath the humming street lamp and asked the first question that mattered. If a dead man made calls, who needed him speaking after death? I was asleep, which is a condition I value and defend, when the telephone by my bed set up a clamor fit to wake a church. I got an arm out from under the blanket, found the receiver by instinct and grievance, and said something that would have disappointed my own aunt. Goodwin? It was Inspector Kramer, sounding as if he had been boiled and then allowed to cool only halfway. No, I told him. This is the mayor. Goodwin is out leading a parade. You're a fool. Get dressed and bring Wolf. At 1:15 in the morning. At 1:15, he said. A man named Elias Vane is dead in his print shop on Riddle Street. Locked room. Funny telephone business. I want Wolf. That woke me more effectively than coffee. What funny telephone business? 3 people say Vane called them after midnight. I sat up. From where? From the shop, apparently. Get down here. He hung up before I could improve the exchange. I shaved enough to avoid frightening the police, got into clothes, and went downstairs in the brownstone on West 35th Street, where Fritz Brenner was already in the hall in a robe, dignified and anxious, because unusual noises after midnight mean either murder or guests, and Fritz preferred murder. Again, he asked. Again, I said. Kramer wants Wolf. Fritz shut his eyes briefly, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in memory of easier employers. He is asleep. Yes, that's what we've got to cure. Getting Nero Wolf out of bed and into a coat in the middle of the night is a task I would not recommend to a man I disliked only moderately. He received the news, sitting upright among pillows, yellow silk pajamas gleaming in the low lamp, his eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. Number yes. Number Kramer, says locked room. Dead printer, and 3 calls from the corpse after midnight. He glared. Archie, do not be fanciful. I'm not being fanciful. I'm being dragged. He swung his feet out of bed with the expression of a Roman emperor, informed that his province had become insolent. If this proves to be another of Kramer's absurdities, I shall not speak to him for a week. That will improve city government. 25 minutes later, we were in the sedan headed downtown through rain that had progressed from wet to purposeful. Wolf sat enormous and outraged beside me, buttoned into his heaviest overcoat, scarf precisely arranged, lips compressed against weather, police, and the modern world. He hates rain when he is in it, police whenever they are near him, and the modern world in principle. Riddle Street was one of those narrow blocks that look guilty even when empty. At that hour it was almost empty unless you count a patrolman, a delivery truck asleep at the curb, and 3 citizens across the way under an awning improving the occasion with conjecture. The sign over the shop said Blackbriar, prints in gold letters, gone tired around the edges. A light burned in the front office. Another showed in the room beyond. Kramer met us at the door, hatless, red-faced, his coat wet to the shoulders. You came. Wolf's eyes moved over him, against nature. Save it. Come in. The front room was narrow, with paper samples on racks, framed specimen cards on the walls, and a counter running along one side. Beyond a half-open partition was the workroom, where a paper cutter, a proofing press, shelves of stock, and a body gave the place distinction. Elias Vane lay face down near the cutter, one arm crooked under him, the other stretched out. A small dark hole showed near the shoulder blade of his coat. His right sleeve was marked with black printer's ink at the cuff. In his left hand, cramped tight even in death, was a torn strip of receipt paper. Wolf stopped 2 paces inside and looked. He never hurries over a corpse. His respect for death is limited, but his respect for evidence is professional. Shot? He asked. Dr. Vollmer, rising from his crouch with medical displeasure at being surrounded by amateurs, said, "Yes, small caliber. Entered the back. Death, quick. Sometime before midnight, probably between 11 and 11:30, I'll be more precise later." I nodded toward the wall clock above the cutter. "Stopped at 11:17, Kramer said. And his watch in the vest pocket stopped at 11:19. "Too neat for me." "Good," Wolf said. "Neatness is often vulgar." He went no farther at first, but let his eyes travel. The rear door was shut. The windows were latched and barred. Nothing looked broken, forced, or theatrical, except the attempt to make it not look theatrical. "Who found him?" I asked. "Assistant District Attorney named Stephen Loring," Kramer said. "Got a call from Vane at 12:25 telling him not to come looking for him. Loring came anyway, found the place dark and locked, banged around, got a patrolman, and then us. Why would Loring come looking? He says Vane had asked him earlier in the evening to stop by before midnight on a confidential matter." "Confidential enough to get him killed?" "That," Kramer said, "is what you're here to tell me." A man detached himself from the front office doorway and came nearer. He was lean, around 35, well-tailored and tired in the face. His eyes were pale and watchful, as if they had recently discovered they could no longer afford trust. "I'm Stephen Loring," he said. "Mr. Wolf, Mr. Goodwin." Wolf inclined his head the width of a postage stamp. "You received a call?" "Yes, at 12:25, Vane said. Do not come here. Do not ask for me." There was a pause between the sentences, very slight, but odd enough that I remember it. Then he said, "You would be wiser to forget tonight." His voice, certainly his voice. Yet Dr. Vollmer says he was dead. Loring looked from Wolf to the body and back, then someone used it. That was reasonable enough to annoy Kramer, who prefers people to be stupid until he has arranged it. Wolf said, "Why were you coming?" Loring's mouth tightened. "Vane telephoned my office yesterday at 6. He said he had found papers connected with a private matter of some age and sensitivity. He asked me to come before midnight if possible. I told him I was engaged until late. He said late would do." "What private matter?" "He didn't say." "Why did he call you?" "Because my father knew him." Wolf's brows moved slightly. And because my father once had dealings with men whose names might appear on old documents Vane had come across." Kramer grunted. "He means scandal." "I mean inheritance," Loring said. Wolf did not pursue it then. He went around the body instead, careful and exact, and stood by the cutter, receipt paper. Kramer nodded to an evidence man who held up the torn strip in tweezers. The figures were smeared, but partly legible. "Looks like restaurant paper," Kramer said. 2 dinners, some amount, and the tail of a printed address or name. 2 dinners, I said. "So, he ate with someone." "New York contains restaurants," Kramer said. "Yes, and companions." Wolf pointed with his chin. "The rear room we went through. It was small and plain: sink, hot plate, cabinet, wrapping table, shelves, 1 window and a pair of straight-backed chairs, one at the little table, one slightly angled from it as if recently used. On a tray were 2 cups and a kettle. I put a hand near the kettle and raised my brows. Still warm." Kramer looked annoyed. "The room's closed up." "Not that warm," I said. Wolf sniffed once and frowned. "Cedar." I sniffed too, under the heavier smells of damp paper, paste, and ink. There was a clean, dry trace, like expensive soap. It did not belong in a printer's washroom any more than a violin belongs in a butcher shop. "Vane used cedar soap?" Wolf asked. Kramer spread his hands. "I didn't ask his toilet articles." "Then ask them now." Wolf crossed to the rear door, examined the lock, the bolt, and the chain, locked from inside when found. "Yes, and the front." "Same. Windows, latched bars outside, and the alley. Only the constable's prints after Loring fetched him. Rain wiped the rest, or there weren't any." Wolf made a small noise. It meant the room had started talking to him, and he had not yet decided whether it was lying. He went back through the workroom and stood looking down at Elias Vane. The dead man was about 50 spare neat, even in collapse, with a clipped mustache and the narrow, disciplined face of a man who balanced his accounts and distrusted adjectives. One shoe had come partly off. There was ink under the nail of the right thumb. His hair was wet along the temple, perhaps from rain earlier, perhaps from sweat before death. "His living room's upstairs?" Wolf asked. "Yes," Kramer said. "2 rooms," we looked. "Not finished." "Who else had keys?" "Working on it. Work faster." Kramer's jaw pushed forward. "Don't preach." "I do not preach, I instruct." I left them to improve one another and went to the front office. The desk there held order books, a telephone, a pencil tray, and one of those black address books fat with names and old paper lint. Beside the telephone was a pad with a few pressure marks on the top sheet. No ink. I angled it to the light. Nothing yet. The window looked onto the street, the shade half. Drawn on a side table stood a dictation machine, old-fashioned, horned and ugly, mostly hidden under invoice rolls. That caught my eye. I bent and saw at once that one wax cylinder was mounted on it, recently shaved and reused. "I didn't touch it, Kramer," I called. He came, saw what I was looking at, and swore softly. "We didn't get to that." "No," I said. "You were busy with death." Wolf arrived behind him. He regarded the machine with concentrated distaste. "Play it." Kramer looked around for objections and found none except his own habit. I set the stylus carefully and turned the crank. There was a hiss. Then Elias Vane's voice filled the room. "Not whole, not natural, patched. Do not come." Hiss, click, looking for me. A pause. "You would be wiser," click, "to forget tonight." The room went still. Even Kramer had the decency not to move. Then the voice again. "Burn." Hiss. "The blue envelope." Pause. Unopened. Another click. Another fragment. "For once in your life, click, be discreet." And then a rough scrape as the cylinder ran out. Kramer cursed with feeling. Loring, behind us in the doorway, had gone white around the mouth. "That, Wolf," said softly, "is not a ghost." "No," I said. "It's editing." Wolf nodded. "And preparation. Someone found Vane's dictation machine, found his old voice, and built messages from it." Loring said, "Then the call to me may have been assembled from recorded fragments," Wolf said, "or guided by them. In either event, someone wanted Elias Vane to survive his own death long enough to give instructions." Kramer snapped. "To who else?" He got his answer 15 minutes later, and not in a form likely to improve his temper. First came Clara Tebbit, widow of a former Queen's Lantern member, and elegant in black rain, wet at the shoulders, carrying herself as if she had been born refusing panic. She said Vane had called her at 12:30 and told her to burn a blue envelope he had given into her keeping weeks earlier. She had not burned it, and had brought it in her handbag. She set it on the desk without flourish. Then came, by telephone, Lewis Dykes at the Hotel Grantham, old actor, cracked, velvet voice, who declared that Vane had called at 12:20, and said, "Say nothing of the Queen's Lantern. For once in your life be discreet." Dykes added, "I knew it was Elias because nobody else sounds like an obituary read aloud by a disappointed executor." Wolf ended the call by replacing the receiver as if it offended him physically. He turned to Clara Tebbit. "Open the envelope." "No," she said. Wolf's eyes narrowed. "Madam, a man is dead." "Yes, and what is inside concerns reputations that may not deserve the police." Kramer exploded. "You don't choose in a murder case." She turned to him, cool as a silver spoon. "Inspector, men who shout at women usually do it because facts fail them." I liked her immediately, and cautiously Wolf said, "Archie." I held out my hand after a brief measured glance. Clara gave me the envelope. It contained 4 carbon copies of letters and a faded photograph. The letters referred to printing private circulars, membership lists, and dinner cards for an organization called the Queen's Lantern Club. Names were partly disguised by initials, but one signature stood clear: Rudolph Fenwick. Another reference mentioned Loring Sr. The photograph showed 7 men in evening clothes at a long table, all looking respectable enough to justify suspicion. Loring stared at it and said, "My father." "Yes," Wolf said. "The dead are proving talkative." Clara Tebbett's face had gone rigid, but not with surprise. She knew more than she had brought, and had brought more than she wanted. "Why did Elias give you this?" Wolf asked. "Because he trusted me. Did you deserve it?" Her gaze met his squarely. "More than most men did. There was history there, old loyalty, not romance. Archie Goodwin is not a mind reader, but I have seen enough rooms go quiet to know when trust has entered wearing gloves." While Wolf put questions to Clara in his softest and most dangerous manner, "I went upstairs with Kramer to look at Vane's rooms. They were narrow, tidy, impersonal, except for a fern in the window and a row of detective novels on a shelf that included one of mine, which I took as a tribute. Drawers had been disturbed recently and not well restraightened. Under the bed was an old steel box, empty. In the top desk drawer, I found carbon paper, sealing wax, and a city archive pass made out to Elias Vane. It had been used often. In the second drawer, under ledger paper, was a small notebook with one phrase penciled and then partly erased: under the street, front vault. I showed it to Kramer. He looked ugly and pleased, which on him is a narrow distinction. "Front vault where?" "That," I said, "is one of the amenities we are here to discover." When we went back down, Wolf was seated in the front office with the blue envelope papers before him, Clara Tebbett in the red chair opposite, and Stephen Loring standing by the window, as if he had forgotten how chairs functioned. Wolf lifted his head as I entered. "Archie." I handed him the notebook. He read the phrase once. "Yes." "Mean anything to you?" Kramer asked. "Not yet, but it has the vulgar sound of literal truth." At that instant, the telephone rang. I took it. A woman's voice, sharp and low. "Is this Nero Wolf's office?" "It often is. This is Mara Vane, Elias's sister. Tell Wolf my brother called me at 12:34, he said. I found it at last, the ledger under the street." Then the line went dead. I straightened. "Where are you?" "Coming there." She did, arriving 20 minutes later in a grey suit and a raincoat that looked as if it had offended her by getting wet. She was tall, dark, spare, and built almost exactly like her brother, except for the eyes, which had more temper and less caution. She repeated the message. She also admitted that Elias had for years believed a hidden ledger existed from the Queen's Lantern days, a master account of names, favors, payments, and embarrassments, concealed somewhere below the old club rooms downtown. He had spoken of it often enough to irritate her, and perhaps himself. "Why did it matter?" Wolf asked. "Because men whose fathers sin in secret still like to inherit cleanly. Your brother intended exposure." She hesitated. "I think he intended leverage first, justice second." "That is a very human order," Wolf said. By then the room was full of names. Elias Vane dead on the floor, Stephen Loring with a father in the photograph, Clara Tebbett with the blue envelope, Lewis Dykes with the club name, and Mara Vane with the hidden ledger. Outside, rain moved steadily down the glass. Inside, Wolf sat among the fragments like a man, listening to an orchestra tune up, and already hearing where the wrong instrument is. Kramer, frustrated by the accumulation, barked, "All right, we've got a murdered printer, old club papers, a supposed hidden ledger, and a dictation machine making dead men talk. What do you know that I don't?" Wolf looked at him without haste. "That the locked room is a performance. The murderer stayed after Vane died. He used the back room, the kettle, the 2 chairs, the dictation machine, and probably the soap. He either assembled or rehearsed those messages, then distributed them to delay some people, alarm others, and widen the apparent time of death. Why? Because Elias Vane was needed alive after midnight." "Alive for what?" Wolf picked up the torn restaurant strip in its envelope and held it to the light. "For paper, for movement. for some act in his name that required him not to be dead yet. That landed harder than Kramer showed, Mara Vane said. The ledger, perhaps, Wolf said. Or something leading to it. He turned to me. Archie, tomorrow morning, you will visit the old Queen's Lantern address, find whether there was indeed a front vault under the street, and discover whether some object has recently been removed from it. Also, obtain from the municipal archive a description of anything Elias Vane signed for in the last week. Kramer glared. That's my territory. Yes, Wolf said, occupy it competently. There are moments when I admire Wolf most, and one of them is when he manages to insult Inspector Kramer in a way so accurate that even Kramer has to save the reply for later. We left the shop near dawn. Riddle Street had gone from sinister to tired. The rain had thinned to a mist, and the city was beginning its daily pretense that night had not happened. On the drive uptown, Wolf said little. He was not asleep. Wolf in silence is more active than most men in debate. At the brownstone, Fritz had hot chocolate waiting and scrambled eggs under cover, because he knows that homicide should never be allowed to interfere with breakfast. Wolf sat at the table in the dining room, huge and composed again, while I gave him the inventory aloud. Dead before midnight, dictation machine with patched messages, blue envelope, old club letters, photograph with Loring's father and Fenwick. Sister says hidden ledger under the street. Notebook upstairs says front vault, 2 cups and a warm kettle, cedar soap, receipt for 2 dinners. Wolf ate a forkful of eggs and nodded. Good. That's all. For now. You think one of them did it? Archie, at present I think at least 3 of them are lying. One is frightened, one is vain, and Inspector Kramer is wet. It is not yet enough. He drank chocolate, shut his eyes for a moment, and opened them again. But the first chapter is ended. Elias Vane is dead. His voice has been stolen. Somewhere under New York there is a ledger men fear more than murder, and someone needed 2 hours bought with a dead man's breath. He rose then because 9 o'clock approached, and the orchids would not tolerate homicide as an excuse. Wolf went upstairs to the plant rooms, where the air is warm and damp and civilized, and the orchids live under rules no murderer may disturb. I went to the office with my notes and the smell of cedar soap still in my head. The story had begun on Riddle Street with a ring after midnight. By breakfast it had acquired an old club, a hidden ledger, a blue envelope, and a voice borrowed from wax and dust. That was enough to satisfy me and irritate Wolf, which is often the proper proportion at the start of a case. Chapter 2. The witnesses of one voice. The butcher heard Elias say he was leaving town. The landlord heard him promise rent by morning. His sister Mara heard him whisper that he had finally found the ledger under the street. Each witness repeated the same pause before the final sentence, like actors remembering their mark. Wolf listened without blinking, letting silence do the cutting work. On Riddle Street, truth rarely hid in what was said. It hid in the shape of repetition. At 11:15 that morning, the office in the brownstone had begun to resemble a waiting room in which nobody expected good news and everyone intended to improve his own portion of it. Wolf had finished with the orchids and was installed behind his desk, broad and yellow-brown and formidable, with his eyes half closed. That is the face he wears when other people are speaking, and he is deciding which parts of them to believe. I was at my desk with notes, the telephone, and a suspicion that before evening half Manhattan would have developed a personal acquaintance with Elias Vane's voice. Inspector Kramer had gone off to harass the city into producing facts. Clara Tebbett had left after depositing the blue envelope, and enough restraint to make me wonder whether her nerves were made of wire. Stephen Loring had not left. He had moved from the red chair by the window to the yellow one by the globe, and back again, which I interpreted as either worry or poor breeding. Wolf ignored him by taking no notice of his movement at all. At 11:17 the bell rang. I opened the door on a large blond man with a butcher's shoulders, a damp hat, and an expression of affront. Nils Haffen, he announced. I have a shop next to Vane's. Come in, I said. If you're bringing sausages, I'll respect you more. He gave me a look suggesting he would cheerfully chop me fine and sell me at a discount, then entered and stood before Wolf's desk. Wolf indicated the red leather chair with a finger. "You heard Elias Vane after midnight," Wolf said. "I heard Elias," Hafen said, sitting only because standing would have looked like surrender. "If the police don't like it, they can make him alive again and ask him, 'What did you hear?'" The butcher frowned, arranging memory with effort and distaste. "I was in the back of my place cleaning up. Side door open to the alley because of the smell. I heard Vane out front or in his doorway say, 'I'm leaving town by morning.' Then there was a little wait. Then he said, 'Tell no one yet.' A little wait," Wolf asked. Hafen spread thick fingers. A pause, like he was catching his breath. "Or reading," I said. He looked at me. "Reading what?" "That's what I'm hoping you'll tell me. I saw nobody. I heard the voice. That's all." Wolf's lids did not stir. "What time?" "After midnight. 12:15 maybe." I had just scrubbed the block and looked at the clock. "You are certain it was Vane?" Hafen snorted. "I've listened to him complain about paper deliveries through a wall for 12 years. I'd know him in a fog." "Was there another voice?" "Number," he considered. "Door may be hard to say." "Rain," Wolf nodded. "Did Vane often speak to you?" "Only when offended." "Were you fond of him?" The butcher actually looked surprised. "Number. Then why are you here?" That checked him. He rubbed a palm on his knee. "Because he paid his bills. Because somebody made a fool of him after he was dead. I don't like that." "Good enough." Wolf dismissed him with a nod and Hafen lumbered out, leaving behind a faint smell of cold meat and honest impatience. Loring said, "That gives us another witness to the voice." "No," Wolf said. "It gives us another witness to a pattern." Loring stared at him. "Aren't those the same?" "Number that shut him up for 12 seconds, which I counted as progress." At 11:43, the bell rang again and brought in Oscar Bimmel. The landlord. He was small, round, overdressed, and polished, with the care of a man who has spent years learning that prosperity speaks more clearly if properly brushed. He sat down as if the chair owed him interest. "Mr. Wolf, I do not enjoy murder," he said. "It depresses rentals. Your sentence," Wolf murmured, "is both vulgar and informative. Proceed." Bimmel frowned but went on. At 12:28, my home telephone rang. "Mr. Vane spoke," he said. "Your rent will be paid by morning." Then a pause. Then, "You have my word." "He was in arrears?" I asked. "1 month." "And had you pressed him?" Repeatedly. "That is what makes cities possible." "Did his tone surprise you?" Wolf asked. "Yes. Elias Vane did not give his word. He gave objections, dates, and arithmetic." This sounded formal, like a man speaking for effect, I said. Bimmel looked at me sharply. "Possibly. There was something stiff in it." "Mechanical?" Wolf asked. "Number human, but stiff." "Did you mention his arrears to anyone besides Vane?" Bimmel hesitated. "His sister. She was at the shop yesterday afternoon when I called." Loring spoke for the first time since Hafen left. "His sister?" Bimmel turned toward him with mild dislike. "Miss Mara Vane, a severe woman. She said my concern for rent was touching and wholly misplaced. I liked her already." When Bimmel had gone, Wolf sat motionless for perhaps half a minute. He does that not to create atmosphere, but because stillness is one of the ways he computes. Then he opened his eyes fully and looked at Loring. "You have not yet told me enough about the Queen's Lantern." Loring's mouth tightened. "I have told you what I know. Then you know little, or lie with economy, which?" "Neither. My father belonged to the club before I was old enough to know what men do when they call secrecy refinement." "That," Wolf said, "is better. Continue." Loring glanced at me, saw no rescue there, and went on. "It was a private dining club, nominally literary, actually political and personal. Men traded favors there, introductions, recommendations, a judge or two, a newspaper man, businessmen. Perhaps worse. My father never discussed it, but I saw enough names later in his papers to know it had been useful. Useful for blackmail? I asked. I don't know. That usually means yes or almost. He ignored me. If Elias Vane found records of the club, they might embarrass heirs. Not all scandals age into comedy. The bell rang again. I got up with a feeling that the day had decided to furnish itself all at once. Mara Vane came in as if entering enemy territory by choice. She was tall, dark, and spare, with a hard intelligence in the set of her mouth and eyes, so like her brothers that the family resemblance walked in before she did. She wore a grey suit, severe enough for judgment, and gloves she removed, as if disarming. "Mr. Wolf," she said, "Inspector Kramer told me where to find you." "Then his usefulness has not entirely vanished," Wolf said. "Sit down." She did, and saw Stephen Loring. If she knew him, she gave no sign beyond the faintest narrowing of the eyes. "I am Mara Vane," she said. "My brother telephoned me last night at 12:34. "What did he say?" Wolf asked. "He said, 'Mara, I found it at last.'" There was a pause. Then, very softly, the ledger under the street. Then the line went dead. Loring leaned forward. "Ledger," Mara turned to him with a coolness that might have glazed a pond. "Yes, Mr. Loring, some families preserve silver, others preserve anxiety," Wolf said. "You expected the phrase. Number, but I recognized it." Elias had spoken of such a ledger for years, an account book or register from the Queen's Lantern period. He believed it had been hidden when the club collapsed. Where? He was never certain. Beneath the old premises somewhere. In a vault, perhaps, or coal cellar. He had only fragments to go on. What fragments? Printing memoranda our father left. Notes about private menus, place cards, guest lists, corrections. Elias handled old paper, the way Mises handle coins. He noticed patterns. Why did it matter to him? Because he hated being shut out of knowledge, because he suspected the ledger contained not merely names, but payments. "Payments for what?" I asked. She looked at me. "What do men usually pay for when they are ashamed to have it written down?" That left a variety of possibilities, all unattractive. Wolf steepled his fingers. "Miss Vane, did your brother have reason to fear anyone?" "Yes." "Whom?" She hesitated, and that made the answer worth more. "Paul Fenwick." Loring stiffened. "Fenwick?" "Yes, Rudolph Fenwick's son. He came to the shop yesterday morning." "What happened?" Wolf asked. "He told Elias that rummaging among the dead could be bad for the living. Elias told him that frightened heirs were no concern of his. Fenwick said they would become his concern if he persisted." "That is a threat," I said. "It was meant to be," Mara replied. Wolf grunted. "Did your brother mention the blue envelope?" She turned her head slightly. "What blue envelope?" That could have been genuine ignorance. It could also have been a neat act. Wolf did not tell her which he preferred. Instead, he asked, "Did Elias dine with anyone last night?" Her eyes flickered once. "I don't know." "You do know." "Number, I suspect." "Whom?" She hesitated again. "A woman?" "Name?" "No name." "Grounds." He had changed his tie when I saw him at 7. My brother never changed his tie without witness. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to behave. Loring looked offended by the remark on behalf of all bachelor dignity. Before Wolf could press further, the telephone rang. I took it, Kramer. His voice suggested he had found something and disliked its manners. "Goodwin. Got another one, or half of one. An old actor at the Hotel Grantham named Lewis Dykes says Vane called him around 12:20 and said, 'Say nothing of the Queen's Lantern. For once in your life, be discreet.' He swears it was Vane. Anything else?" "Yeah, I'm sending over a copy of the exchange timing sheet and Volmer Titan's time of death to not later than 11:30. Probably earlier than that if you ask him twice," I told Wolf, who nodded, as if the fact had merely learned to stand up straight. "Mr. Dykes," he said, belongs to the club history, Loring answered. A hanger on amateur theatricals. After dinner recitations, social debris, Mara said. Useful debris. He remembers everything except money owed him. Wolf looked from one to the other. You both know him. That was enough of an answer by itself. For the next 20 minutes Wolf did almost nothing except make them repeat the words they had heard. Hafen's line, Bimmel's line, Loring's line, Mara's line. He asked them to say each message exactly, then again, then a third time with the pause where it had come. Loring frowned. Why? Because it is the same pause, Mara said. What of that? It is too similar. A natural speaker varies rhythm with person, purpose, emotion, interruption, yet all of you report a statement, then a slight pause, then a tagline. Mr. Hafen, leaving town, tell no one yet. Mr. Bimmel, rent by morning. You have my word, Mr. Loring, do not come. Forget tonight, Miss Vane, found it at last. The ledger under the street, each is built alike. I said, like type set to the same measure. Wolf glanced at me. Yes. Mara Vane's face sharpened. You think the words were prepared? I think, Wolf said, that the shape of them was. Loring rose and took 2 steps, then stopped himself. A recording? Perhaps, or imitation, I said. Somebody using Elias's voice with a guide. Mara looked from me to Wolf. Can that be done? Certainly, Wolf said. Badly by many, well by a few. That brought the dictation machine back into the center of the room without it being physically present. Elias Vane's own voice, preserved in scraps. Enough to cut and arrange. Enough to plant a dead man in 6 ears after midnight. Kramer arrived in person with the exchange sheet and the expression of a man who had lost a fight with telephones. Records are muddy in rain, he said. But I've got enough for times. Dykes got something at 12:20, 1, Loring 12:20, 5, Bimmel 12:20, 8, Tebbet 12:30, Mara Vane 12:34. Hafen's isn't a phone call, just a voice heard from the street or doorway. Wolf studied it. Interesting. What? Kramer snapped. The intervals, deliberate spacing, enough time to place or simulate calls without haste. Kramer swore. You think one man did all of them? Number, I think one intelligence planned them. That was the point where the room settled into a different seriousness. Up to then we had a murder and a trick. Now we had design. Kramer turned to Mara. You held out Fenwick from my men. She met his glare and did not blink. Your men ask blunt questions and then become injured when they receive blunt answers. That's cute. No, Wolf said. It is obstructive, Miss Vane. You will not do it again. She looked at him and something altered. Perhaps she saw that he was the first man in the room not bullying or pleading, merely arranging. Very well, she said. When she had gone, followed shortly by Loring under instructions not to vanish. Kramer remained. I poured coffee. Wolf refused, then accepted it, which means he needed it. He sat silent for a while, then said, Archie review. I did. Dead before midnight. Voice heard after midnight by at least 5 people, maybe 6 if Clara makes it official. Same pause pattern in each message. Possible old ledger from the Queen's lantern hidden under the street. Fenwick threatened Elias. Landlord and butcher provide neutral witnesses to extend time of life. Dictation machine exists and contains patched fragments of Elias's voice. Wolf nodded. Good. The important point is the neutral witnesses. Kramer grunted. Meaning, Mr. Hafen and Mr. Bimmel gain nothing by invention. Therefore, their reports are especially useful to the murderer, not because they prove Elias lived, but because they spread the impression beyond the interested circle. A sister, a widow, and a son of an old member may all be suspected of collusion or confusion. A butcher and a landlord are ballast. I said. So the dead man was not just speaking after death. He was being advertised. Wolf's eyes closed. Exactly. That phrase stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Advertised, a printer's death arranged like a broadside. By 4 o'clock, the house had settled into its usual rhythms again, which only made the violence underneath seem more pointed. Fritz moved quietly in the hall with trays and dignity. The old clock in the office took its measured bite out of each quarter. Outside, New York shoved and glittered in its daily way, carrying 1,000 secrets at once and caring for none of them long. Inside, Wolf leaned back in the chair, fingertips together, and looked as if the facts had begun to offend him personally. "Well?" I said. He opened one eye. "Well, what? Do you know yet who needed Elias speaking after death?" "Number." "Then what do you know?" He shut the eye again. "That the murderer is not merely clever. He is orderly." That sounds like praise. It is not orderly murderers grow arrogant. Arrogance creates pattern. Pattern is the beginning of surrender. That was the most I got before dinner, but it was enough. We had moved from voices to structure, from shock to arrangement. On Riddle Street, truth was, indeed, not hiding in the content of what had been said. It was hiding in how evenly the dead man had said it, how each sentence paused in the same place, like a speaker, waiting for the next strip of wax to catch. Elias Vane had spoken after death. Yes, but by the end of that day Wolf no longer heard a ghost in it. He heard composition. Chapter 3. The print shop with no exit. Elias was found in the back room of Blackbriar Prints, face down beside the paper cutter, his coat sleeve marked with fresh ink and a torn strip of receipt paper clenched in his fist. The shop door had been bolted from inside, the windows latched, the alley untouched by footprints, except those of the constable. Yet Wolf noticed a kettle still warm, a chair placed for two, and the faint smell of cedar soap that did not belong to Elias. A locked room, he liked to say, was only a confession dressed as architecture. By 6 o'clock that evening, Wolf had become sufficiently annoyed by the case to revisit it, which is one of the ways he shows affection. He had spent the afternoon in the office hearing witnesses, rejecting distractions, and consuming coffee with a gravity equal to theology. And now he declared that Riddle Street had lied to him once and should not be permitted a second attempt. Inspector Kramer received this with the resignation of a man who has lost too many arguments to conserve outrage. He met us at the shop with Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins and a key, and let us in with the expression of one admitting not guests but a weather condition. Blackbriar Prints looked less dramatic and more stubborn in the evening. Crime scenes often do. Morning gives them attention. Dusk gives them character. The front office was in shadow except for the hanging lamp over the desk. Beyond it, the workroom held its tables and machines with the dull patience of things that know they will outlast scandal. The body was gone, but the chalk marks on the floor had not improved the place. They merely made absence official. Wolf stood at the threshold and looked without moving. He does that not for effect, though it has some, but because a room speaks in relations before details. Table to door, clock to body, cups to kettle, window to alley. If you rush at objects, you miss the grammar. "Well," Kramer said. Wolf ignored him for 40 seconds, which I counted because I had nothing else to do. Then he went first not to the chalk outline, but to the rear room. That room was narrow, with a sink, a hot plate, a shelf of wrapping materials, a cabinet, and a small table. On the table sat the kettle and 2 cups, both washed but not equally well. One had been rinsed and set upside down. The other bore the faint tan crescent left by coffee drying where the water had missed it. The second chair was angled back from the table, as if someone had pushed it away in a hurry or risen from it with force. Wolf bent, sniffed, and straightened, still cedar. I sniffed and got it too, clean, dry, expensive, and wholly out of place among ink, paste, and damp cardboard. "Fancy soap," I said. "Yes, male or female?" "That question," Wolf said, "is beneath your intelligence and above your information," Kramer grunted. We checked upstairs. Vane used plain yellow laundry soap, a cracked cake of it by the basin. "Good," Wolf said. "Then someone carried refinement into his back room and left traces of it." He pointed to the kettle. Was it warm when first found? Warm, Kramer said. Not hot. Time about 1:20 when the patrolman first got in. Wolf looked at the hot plate, then at the cord. And was it plugged in? Pearlie answered. Yes. Interesting, I said. Meaning the killer stayed after Elias died, made coffee, washed up, and then remembered to construct a miracle. No, Wolf said. Meaning someone used the room after death with enough calm to boil water. That is not panic. It is business. He turned to the cups again. Any prints? Smudges, Kramer said. Not useful. Of course. That was Wolf at his driest. Murderers with enough sense to stage impossibility usually also have enough to wipe handles. What they miss is not where they touch first, but where they touch later when their attention has shifted. He crossed back into the workroom. The cutter stood where it had, metal blade clean now, but the wood block scarred by old work and one new dark stain. The chalk outline showed Elias Vane face down, one arm twisted under him, the other reaching toward the front office. Near the outline, a tag marked where the torn receipt strip had been found. Show me, Wolf said. Pearlie handed over the evidence envelope. The strip was narrow and ragged, with smeared numbers and a fragment of printed type. I could make out 2 dinners and part of an address or name ending Innington. Lexington, I said. Or Harrington, Kramer said. New York contains both possibilities and fewer dead printers, I told him. Wolf held the strip to the light. It was torn, not cut, obviously, Kramer said. Yes, in haste or struggle, less obvious. He lowered it and looked at the chalk line again. Face down, shot from behind. Receipt in hand, ink on sleeve. He moved to the garment bag hanging from a hook and inspected the right cuff of Elias's coat where the ink smear had dried in a broad thumbed streak. Fresh? He asked. Kramer nodded. Printer's ink. From this room, presumably. Presume less, Wolf said. I came closer. The stain was not random brush or transfer from leaning. It lay on the cuff and lower sleeve, as if the arm had slid or been grabbed against a tacky surface. Maybe he braced himself on the press, I said. Or on the desk, Wolf murmured. Or someone seized him with an inky hand. That improved the possibilities while worsening my comfort. I like a case to move, but not always in the direction it chooses. Wolf went to the front office and stood over the desk. The old dictation machine, discovered that morning and now removed to police custody, had left a clean rectangle among dust and invoice rolls. The telephone sat where it had, black and blunt. Beside it lay the notepad with faint pressure marks on the top sheet. Have you raised the indentations? Wolf asked. Not yet, Kramer said. Then do so before someone more competent does it for you. I grinned, but only inwardly. Wolf and Kramer in the same room is one of the few entertainments I enjoy without guilt. He bent closer to the desk, not at the pad but at the drawer handle. This was opened. Kramer said, We opened it. Yes, before that. How can you tell? The Polish is disturbed in an arc narrower than your constable's methods. Also, the edge has fresh paper lint. That one annoyed Kramer because it sounded like magic and was only a tension. We opened the drawer again. Order slips, carbon books, sealing wax, string, and a receipt book with 2 stubs missing. Not the ordinary daily receipt book, but a smaller one used for private jobs. Wolf turned the remaining stubs slowly. One for yesterday morning, I said. No customer name. Cash jobs, Kramer muttered. Printers do them. Yes, Wolf said, and murderers like them. He set the book down and turned to the front door. The lower bolt had been thrown when the body was found. So had the rear. The windows were latched, the alley silent behind the dirty glass. Come, Wolf said. We went out through the rear. The alley was narrow and mean, brick on both sides, with garbage cans pretending innocence. The rain from the night before had left the ground slick enough to preserve anything that wanted preserving, but according to the police, there had been only the constable's later prints and old confusions. Wolf looked not at the ground first, but up fire escape above. Third, floor landing. No ladder lowered. Could a man cross from that roof? He asked. Pearlie pointed. To the next building. Yes, but no trace. Because the rain washed it. Or because nobody did it. Wolf grunted. A locked room is rarely about escape. It is about persuasion. Kramer sighed. You said that already. I shall go on saying useful things until they bruise you. Back inside, Wolf asked for the exact sequence from discovery to entry. Kramer gave it. Loring arriving after the warning call, finding front and back locked, summoning a patrolman, then police entry with Vane's own key found later in his pocket. No broken lock. No hidden access. No miracle worth the name. When Kramer finished, Wolf turned to me. Archie, suppose the killer had a key. All right, he departs. Locks the back. Circles, enters the front. Bolts it, then vanishes. Through the wall. Do not be tiresome. Then the architecture still doesn't work. Exactly, therefore, the locking was done by someone who remained inside longer than the murder itself required. I said. Long enough for the kettle, cups, and soap. And for the dictation machine, he said. That landed in the room with a little weight. The dead man's borrowed voice had to be assembled, rehearsed, or at least selected. If the murderer had done it here, then the shop was not merely the scene of death, it was a workshop afterward. Kramer frowned. You think he cut the messages here after the shooting? Perhaps not all, but he had access here to the machine, the office, Vane's notes, and perhaps the address list. He might have selected phrases or found cylinders to carry away, I said. Then the calls themselves may have been made elsewhere. Yes, and this place locked up to support the idea that they were made from here. Precisely. Wolf moved again to the chalk outline and stood over the dead man's last position with a kind of restrained disgust. The receipt in his hand bothers me. Because? Kramer asked. Because dying men clutch significance, not litter. I looked at the strip again. 2 dinners. Yes, so he ate with someone connected to the murder. Probably. Unless the killer planted it. Wolf's eyes went to me, would he? Why plant an incomplete clue that points not to himself but to a meal? Number Vane seized it or retained it. Why? To identify, to accuse, or to remind himself. He went silent, and I knew that tone in him even without words. The room had yielded something not yet shaped enough for use. Then he did a thing that always tells me the case is alive. He sat down in the second chair at the little table in the back room, slowly, carefully, as if testing not the furniture but the posture of the absent person. He looked at the cup with the dried coffee rim. The visitor sat here. You sure? I asked. Number. But the cup says so. How? The rinsed cup was likely Vane's. A man alone in his own room rinses his own cup automatically. A guest's cup is more often neglected or imperfectly washed, especially after interruption. Kramer snorted. That's thin. Of course it is thin, Wolf said. So is paper, yet you build cases on it. I nearly applauded. Wolf rose again and looked toward the sink. He offers coffee, they speak. Then either they move into the workroom and the shooting occurs, or the visitor rises first and Vane turns his back. Afterward, the visitor washes hands. Perhaps the cup. Perhaps not enough. Notices the soap, or uses it from habit. Then turns to the office and the machine. I said, You're making a schedule for him. No, I said. I mean, why so tidy? If they quarreled, why is the back room calm? He nodded once. Good they did not quarrel there. The quarrel was elsewhere or not verbal. The meeting may even have begun amiably. Kramer said, With a bullet in the back. Yes, Wolf said. The back is often where amiability ends. Pearlie coughed to hide either amusement or a cold. We stayed another 15 minutes, while Wolf studied shelf dust, paper stocks, and the floor between rear room and office. At last he stopped by the front counter and looked down at a brass customer bell. No one had mentioned because it was too ordinary. What time was the clock stopped? He asked. 11:17. And the watch? 11:9:18. Wolf touched the bell lightly, Manufactured time, not actual time, Kramer said. I knew that. No, Wolf said. You suspected it. I know it. That was too much for Kramer's digestion, but before he could retort, Wolf had turned away and headed for the door, signaling that the room had given him what it would for now. Outside on Riddle Street, the evening had gone from damp to chilly, and the street lamp over the shop hummed faintly, as if resenting the electric bill. Wolf stood on the curb and looked back at the shuttered front. Well, I said. He adjusted his scarf. The room is not impossible. It is vain. That's rough on architecture. Architecture deserves it when men misuse it. Kramer came out behind us. You've got something. Yes. What? The murderer remained in the shop after Elias Vane died. He used the back room and the office. He handled the dictation machine or the records associated with it. He probably washed with cedar soap, not belonging to Vane. He locked the place to suggest impossibility and to conceal occupation, and he either dined with Vane himself or wished us to believe Vane had dined with someone significant. Kramer chewed that. Name him. Number. Why not? Because I cannot yet prove whether the visitor was male or female, whether the dinner companion was the killer or bait, or whether the locked parcel we do not yet know about has already entered the case. Kramer blinked. Locked parcel. Wolf's eyes narrowed. I said, if Inspector, do try to keep up. On the drive back uptown, I asked him, why the bell? What bell? The customer bell. It told me nothing. You stared at it. Yes, I was considering whether Vane admitted his killer as a customer or an appointment. That's nothing. It is not yet something. At the brownstone, Fritz met us with the grave look of a man who had kept dinner within the boundaries of excellence, despite police interference. Wolf went at once to the dining room, because homicide may rearrange facts, but not meal times, while he ate roast duck, celery root, and potatoes, treated as if they had diplomatic value. I sat in the office and went over the room in my mind. Dead printer, shot in the back. Receipt strip in hand, warm kettle, 2 cups, cedar soap, dictation machine, locked doors, no useful footprints. Clock and watch stopped too neatly. A murderer who had stayed behind not from fear, but from purpose. When Wolf came in afterward with coffee and settled into the big chair, I said, so the shop with no exit did have one. He closed his eyes. Certainly. Where? In the murderer's confidence. That's elegant and no help. It is both. He did not need a miraculous escape. He needed us to waste effort admiring the locks. And we won't. We may, but not long. I leaned back. Then what mattered in there? His eyes opened, not how he left, why he stayed. That was the chapter's true hinge, and Wolf knew it before I did. The room had not been arranged to conceal escape. It had been arranged to buy time for work, washing, choosing, locking, perhaps cutting Elias Vane's voice into instructions, perhaps searching for notes that led under the street. The architecture had not trapped the murderer. It had served him, and that, as Wolf would have said if he had been feeling generous with words, was the first honest statement the room had made. Chapter 4. The records that refused to speak when the phone exchange books were opened. The mystery sharpened, instead of easing. No outgoing calls from Elias's line matched the hours the witnesses swore they had answered. Not one click, not one routed minute, not one operator note. Wolf tapped the page with one finger and smiled the way a man smiles at a liar who has finally become useful. If the calls were never made, then the voice had traveled by another road. By 10 o'clock, the next morning, Inspector Kramer was in our office with a leather folder under his arm and a disposition that would have soured milk in winter. Wolf had just come down from the plant rooms, full of orchid humidity and disapproval, and was seating himself behind the desk with the care of a man lowering a monument into position. I was at my own desk with coffee and optimism, both of them moderate. Kramer flung the folder down. There, Wolf glanced at it. Is that an argument or evidence? Both exchange records. That got my attention. It got Wolf's too, though he showed it only by extending 2 fingers toward the folder as if it might be contagious. Kramer opened it and spread out carbon sheets, routing slips, operator logs, and a typed summary with red pencil marks, savage enough to suggest personal betrayal. "We checked the whole business again," he said. "Main exchange, neighborhood board, local routing times, operator notations. No outgoing calls from Blackbriar Prince between midnight and 1. None. Not to Loring, not to Clara Tebbit, not to Dykes, not to Mara Vane, not to anybody in Queens, and not to the butcher next door, unless Vane learned to telephone through Brick." I sat up straighter. "Nothing at all. One incoming at 12:17, Kramer said. "Short, that's all. No outgoing calls from that line in the whole stretch." Wolf touched the top page with one finger and looked down at it. Then, very slowly, his lips moved into the faintest curve I had seen all morning. Kramer scowled. "What's funny?" "Not funny," Wolf said. "Useful." He tapped the page once. "Until this moment, we had an inconvenience. Now we have a fact," I said, "which is that the dead man did not call anyone from his shop after midnight." Kramer barked. "Of course he didn't. He was dead." Wolf turned his head. "Do not be childish. You have been laboring under the theory that someone in the shop used Vane's line to stage his continued life. The exchange now denies that. Therefore, the apparent location of the voice was false as well as the voice itself." I grinned. "If the calls were never made from Elias's line, then the trick was bigger than we thought." "Precisely," Wolf said, "and therefore more informative. That is Wolf entire. Give him one impossibility, and he is annoyed. Give him two that cancel each other, and he begins to be interested." I took the sheets and ran my eye down the times. The incoming call at 12:17 stood there alone like a nail. Nothing after, nothing before except ordinary business earlier in the evening. "What about the witnesses?" I asked. "They answered phones." "Yes," Kramer said sourly. "Or think they did." "No," Wolf said. "Better. They answered phones and heard what they reported. But what they heard did not originate where they supposed." He leaned back, eyes half closed. "If a lie survives one test, it gains bulk. If it fails, it gains shape." Kramer grunted. English. "The voice traveled by another road," Wolf said. "That sat there. It was good. I wished I had said it first." At point the bell rang, and I went to get the day's next complication. It was Clara Tebbit, fresh from some expensive district where umbrellas are probably folded by butlers. She came in, saw Kramer, and did not like it, but she liked ignorance less. "Well?" she asked. Wolf indicated a chair. "Mrs. Tebbit, your midnight call did not come from Elias Vane's telephone." She stopped before sitting. "How do you know?" "The exchange records." Her brows lifted. "Then I was deceived more thoroughly than I thought." "No," Wolf said, "only differently." She took the chair. Kramer, who dislikes poised women because they refuse to register his official weather, folded his arms and glowered. Clara ignored him with skill. "You are certain?" she asked. "Yes." "Then how was it done?" Wolf shrugged. "With intention. The mechanism remains fluid," I said. "Possibly a recording, possibly a mimic, possibly calls placed from somewhere else after a rehearsal with the dictation machine." She looked at me. "Could anyone imitate Elias that well?" "Perhaps not anyone," Wolf said, "but someone on a poor line, after midnight, with expectation already primed." "Certainly," Kramer muttered. "That actor Haft?" Wolf nodded. "Yes, Julian Haft returns." That name had become tiresome enough to deserve action. Wolf told me to get Louis Dykes on the telephone at once. "I did," Dykes answered, as if telephones were a social disease, and he had acquired immunity through sarcasm. "Goodwin, this had better be elegant." "It's not, Julian Haft." A pause. Then, "What about him?" "You told us the Queen's Lantern had theatrical debris. It had several varieties. Haft was one. Mimic, reciter, dinner nuisance occasionally, brilliant when sober. Could he imitate Elias Vane?" "Why do you ask questions you already want answered yes to?" "Of course he could, if he had reason and a sample. When did you last see him? Years he moved from clubs to second-rate radio, then from radio to drinking. Last I heard, he had rooms in the village and creditors in 2 boroughs. I got the address, thanked him with more sincerity than he deserved, and hung up. Wolf was still looking at the exchange sheets. Archie, note the incoming call at 12:17. I've got it, to the shop, just before the false series began elsewhere. Therefore, it may have triggered the next stage. Kramer frowned. You mean somebody called in, got no answer because Vane was dead, and then started placing the fake calls? Possibly, or someone at the shop received instructions from an accomplice before leaving, or the caller was verifying that the line would seem active. We are not yet entitled to choice. That annoyed Kramer. Because he likes entitlement, Clara said quietly. Then the warm kettle and the washed cups still matter. Wolf turned to her. Very much. The shop was occupied after Vane died, but not for the purpose of making calls from there. Therefore, the occupier remained for other work, searching, selecting records, perhaps using the dictation machine, perhaps waiting. Waiting for what? I asked. For the city to become properly midnight, Wolf said, or for an accomplice to act. That shifted the case again. A murderer in a locked shop is one kind of nuisance. A murderer in a locked shop with an accomplice abroad is another and more expensive. Kramer said, all right, suppose the calls were placed from somewhere else. Why tell the landlord rent would be paid? To extend life beyond the circle, Wolf said at once. A neutral witness. Mr. Haffen and Mr. Bimmel were not emotionally involved. Their testimony serves chronology. And Mara, to direct attention under the street. And Loring, to keep him away from the shop. And Mrs. Tebbit, to destroy the envelope. And Dykes. Wolf's lips moved. That is the most interesting one. To silence memory, to prevent him naming the club, or to flatter him into feeling central, Clara said. All 3 are possible with Mr. Dykes. That was fair. The bell rang again. This time it was Stephen Loring. He entered, saw Clara and Kramer, saw the papers, and knew at once something had changed. What is it? Wolf told him. Loring went pale, but in an orderly way. Then the calls were staged from outside. Yes. Then whoever did it knew, not only Elias's voice but the witnesses. Yes, and the times. Yes, Loring's jaw tightened. Then it was one of us. Wolf opened his eyes wider. Do not be melodramatic. It was someone acquainted with your little historical infection. That is not the same as one of you, though it may include you, I said. You are taking that beautifully. He ignored me. What about the archive? Kramer looked up. What archive? That sharpened the room so quickly. You could have shaved with it. Loring knew it. The instant the words left him, Wolf's head turned. Yes, Mr. Loring. Loring hesitated. Not long, but enough. Elias mentioned once that if the ledger was not under the old club vault, there might be related material in municipal storage. Permit records, licensing complaints, private nuisance filings. Old club papers sometimes ended there when buildings changed hands. Kramer took one step toward him. You forgot that before? I did not forget. I discounted it. Convenient. Yes, Wolf said. But not impossible, Inspector. You will have someone at the municipal archive within 15 minutes. Archie, note all records connected with the Queen's Lantern, old club licensing, transferred private papers, and any sign-outs in Elias Vane's name. Kramer glared at Loring. If this turns out to be something you sat on, I'll shake your father's portrait. When he had gone to telephone it in from the hall, Wolf looked at Loring with concentrated distaste. You are educated, he said. That should have made you useful sooner. Clara asked. If the calls were not from the shop, then where was the murderer between midnight and 1? Wolf folded his hands. Excellent. There are now 3 possibilities. First, he remained in the shop, while an accomplice made the calls elsewhere. Second, he left the shop after arranging the locked room appearance and made the calls himself from a series of telephones. Third, the calls were not wholly live but played or relayed from some mechanical setup. I said, That one sounds fancy. Wolf snorted. Then discard it, since fancy things never occur in crime. That was aimed at me and perhaps at the Century. The hall door opened and Kramer came back. Man's on his way to Center Street. Good, Wolf said. Meanwhile, Archie will visit Julian Haft. Why Archie? Because police uniforms make small liars large. Mr. Goodwin does the reverse. I got my hat on the way out. Wolf stopped me. One thing more, ask Haft whether a man with a recording and enough money could have produced those messages without hiring him. I said, money helps almost anything. Yes, Wolf said, but stupidity can still obstruct it. Julian Haft lived in a third-floor room in the village, over a shop that sold sheet music, and had long since made peace with failure. He was valuable now, not because he made the calls, but because he explained how little talent was needed if the phrases were short, the line poor, and the speaker coached by Vane's own recorded pauses. He answered my knock in a dressing gown that had once been maroon, and was now a negotiation. He was in his 50s, smooth, narrow, and delicately wrecked. Yes, Archie Goodwin, near a Wolf. That opened the door another 2 inches. Which is worse? Depends who's paying. I want to ask about Elias Vane. The name changed him. Not much, but enough. He let me in. His room held books, old playbills, a bottle trying not to be seen, and a voice, training mirror on the wall. I told him Vane was dead and watched him absorb it. Good God, he said softly. Then it was not a joke. What wasn't? He sat down slowly. A man came to see me 3 nights ago. Asked whether I could reproduce a particular voice if given samples. Whose? He didn't say. Played me a rough dictation fragment on a portable machine. Thin, careful voice, measured, with those peculiar little pauses before finishing phrases. I said yes, I could imitate it. He asked whether I would place several brief telephone calls in character. I said no. Why? I am Vane, not yet damned. That was better than many answers I have had. Did he identify himself? Number, description. Haft gave me one, broad, well-dressed, expensive gloves, controlled voice, faint scar by one ear, that made my eyebrows behave badly. Fenwick had a scar by one ear. Could he have done it himself if you refused? I asked. Haft pursed his lips. If he had the recorded samples and patience, perhaps enough for brief phrases, especially if he built from existing fragments, or cut cylinders. Yes. I thanked him, got back uptown fast, and found the office waiting with the silence of people who knew news was coming and preferred it to be theirs. I gave Wolf Haft's description. Loring went still. Clara watched me. Kramer had not yet returned from Center Street. Fenwick may have wanted the trick, I said, but Creed had enough access to perform it himself once Haft refused. Wolf nodded once. Yes, Fenwick may have sought the trick, but Creed had the access, the machine, and Vane's habits close at hand. Haft says the customer brought a recording sample and wanted several brief calls in character. Yes. Haft refused. Yes, so the customer either found another mimic or did it himself with the dictation machine. Or with both, Wolf said. At that moment Kramer came back, looking happier than before, which on him resembles indigestion with a medal pinned to it. The archive had a request slip, he said. Queen's Lantern permits, nuisance files, and transfer records were pulled 2 days ago, signed for by Elias Vane. Did he collect them? Wolf asked. Yes. Clark remembers him. Thin, dry, polite, looked like an undertaker who knew grammar. Then Vane had already been digging there, I said. More, Kramer said. A second request was made last night by telephone, asking that a sealed packet connected with those records be ready for pickup. Wolf's eyes narrowed. In Vane's name? Yes. There it was, not full-grown yet, but unmistakable. Elias Vane had not merely been kept alive in people's ears. He had been kept active on paper. Wolf leaned back and closed his eyes. That meant not fatigue, but arrangement. When he opened them, he looked almost content. Good. The records have begun to speak by refusing the first story. The calls did not come from the shop. Therefore, the locked room purchased time for one task, while the dead man's voice purchased time for another. We now require only the transaction that fills the interval, I said. That sounds as if we're buying something unpleasant. We are, Wolf said. Truth in New York is rarely sold wholesale. Outside, the afternoon had gone grey and metallic, with traffic murmuring along 35th Street, and the brownstone holding its own civilized calm against the city's racket. Inside, the case had turned a corner. The voice after midnight was no longer a trick confined to one room. It was a route, a distribution, a deliberate extension of Elias Vane's existence across telephones, witnesses, and records. A dead man had not called from Blackbriar Prince, but somebody had made sure the city believed he was still moving through it. Chapter 5. A voice borrowed from dust inside the print shop office. Wolf found Elias's dictation machine hidden beneath stacks of invoice rolls, its wax cylinder newly shaved and reused. He played it once, and the room turned still. Elias's own voice spilled out, patched together from old business notes and careful pauses, ending with phrases the witnesses remembered word for word. Someone had not only staged the calls, but rehearsed Elias into surviving his own murder. The trick was clever, but cleverness always leaves fingerprints where panic wipes them badly. By 4 that afternoon, the dictation machine was on Wolf's desk in the office on West 35th Street, where it looked as welcome as a wet umbrella at dinner. Inspector Kramer had brought it himself, partly because he did not trust subordinates with anything that had begun to look important, and partly because he wanted to see Wolf hear it without benefit of police grammar. It was under invoice rolls in the front office, Kramer said. You already know that. What you don't know is this cylinder had been shaved and cut over recently. Lab says the wax is fresh on top and older beneath. Wolf regarded the machine with distaste. A hideous contrivance. Yes, I said, but talkative. Clara Tebbett was there, in the red chair by the window, calm on the surface and not far beneath it. Stephen Loring had stayed too, though not by invitation. He was standing near the globe, which is a poor place for a man with nerves, since Wolf notices fidgeting as if it were gunfire. Play it, Archie, Wolf said. I set the cylinder, adjusted the needle, and turned the crank. There was a dry hiss, then a click, and Elias Vane's voice came out of the horn. It was his voice. All right, thin, exact, and oddly deliberate, like a man placing commas where other men would settle for breath. But no living man had spoken this sequence whole. You could hear the joins if you listened for them. Mr. Bimmel, your rent by morning. A pause. You have my word. Another click, a scrape, and the voice again. Do not come, looking for me. Pause. You would be wiser to forget tonight. Loring's hand tightened on the chair back. Clara did not move at all. Then, burn the blue envelope. Pause. Unopened. Then another fragment. The Queen's lantern. Say nothing. Pause. For once in your life, be discreet. When it ended, the room stayed still an extra second, as if each of us expected the dead printer to add one more correction. Wolf's eyes were half closed. Again, Kramer grunted. I heard it the first time. Yes, Wolf said. You also hear thunder. It does not follow that you understand weather. I played it again. This time Wolf listened, not to the phrases but to the spaces between them. When it ended, he said, not all one source. I nodded. Some old dictation, some inserted. Precisely. The pauses are genuine habit, the joins are labor. Kramer crossed his arms. Meaning what? Meaning, Wolf said, that someone had access to Elias Vane's stored voice, and either enough skill to assemble these messages from separate records, or enough vanity to rehearse against them until the imitation passed. That points to imitation, I said. Perhaps. Or to the man who tried to hire Haft, and when refused, used the recordings to coach himself into a passable imitation. Loring spoke. Fenwick. Wolf turned his head. Do not rush. Rich men often look guilty because they are accustomed to buying shortcuts. Murder is only one more shortcut if one lacks imagination. I inspected the base of the machine. Near the feed arm was a black smear, and beside it a pale film almost chalky. Here. Kramer came around. What is it? I sniffed lightly. Soap, Cedar. Clara. Tebbett's eyes narrowed. The same smell from the shop. Yes, Wolf said. A good memory is a humane gift when it is not attached to a fool. Kramer made a note for the laboratory. Wolf reached for the cardboard cylinder box and turned it in his fingers. There too, he said. He was right. In one corner, a dark thumb drag had caught dust and soap powder together. Panic had wiped handles and bolts, but not packaging. That is the trouble with cleverness. It attends to the large deception and neglects the small clumsiness. I said, so our arranger washed up after using the machine. Or before, Wolf said, but certainly with the wrong soap in the wrong place. Clara asked quietly, could the calls have been made from this machine directly? No, Wolf said. Only prepared by it. The voice was borrowed here and sent elsewhere. Loring frowned. Then the shop was used as a workshop after Elias died. Yes, for how long? Wolf lifted a shoulder. Long enough to search, to select records, to prepare or collect voice fragments, and to lock the room into a false dignity, Kramer said. And all that after shooting a man in the back. Wolf looked at him. Inspector, murder is often less exciting to the murderer than to the police. Once Elias Vane was dead, the real work began. That settled badly, and therefore accurately. The bell rang. I went and brought in Julian Haft, who looked like a man uncertain whether he had come to identify a suspect or audition for bankruptcy. Wolf showed him a newspaper photograph of Paul Fenwick. Haft needed 3 seconds. That is the man, he said, the one who asked whether a voice could be made to survive on the telephone. Kramer let out a sound halfway between satisfaction and appetite. Wolf merely nodded. Did he mention the name Vane? Wolf asked. Number did he ask about cutting cylinders? Yes, he knew enough to ask the wrong questions carefully. When Haft had gone, Kramer said, that's good enough for me. No, Wolf said. It is good enough for your temper, not yet for your case. I said, what is missing now? Wolf leaned back in the chair. Why the messages differed, why Bimmel gets rent, Haffen gets departure, Loring gets warning, Mrs. Tebbett gets the envelope, Dykes gets silence, and Mara gets the ledger. It is not merely extension of life, it is distribution of purpose. Outside the office window, the city was sliding toward evening, grey and metallic, with taxicabs hissing on wet pavement. Inside, Elias Vane had just spoken twice from wax dust and bad faith. The trick was handsome in a nasty way, and for a few hours it must have looked perfect to the man who made it. But panic had done what panic always does. It had scrubbed the obvious and smeared the overlooked. Cedar soap, a thumb drag on a box, freshly shaved wax, a rich man asking an actor how long a dead voice could stay useful. Wolf put a finger on the machine and said, almost mildly, he borrowed the dead man's voice, because he could not trust the living one. That is always expensive. By the time we are done, Mr. Fenwick may discover how expensive. Chapter 6. The hours that had to be bought. Wolf drew the timeline across the print shop wall with chalk. Elias died before midnight. Yet the false calls pushed his living presence past 1 in the morning, stretching his shadow over 2 missing hours. Those hours mattered because they covered a delivery nobody was meant to notice. A locked parcel removed from the city archive and signed out in Elias's name. Whoever staged the calls did not need Elias alive in body, only alive on paper. At noon, Nero Wolf stood in Blackbriar Prints with a piece of chalk in his hand, which was a sight I would have paid to avoid, and Kramer got free. Wolf dislikes going out, rain, police rooms, commercial premises, and chalk dust on his cuffs. That morning he had all 5. Be grateful, I told him. The corpse is elsewhere. He gave me a look. Archie, your efforts to brighten reality are vulgar. Inspector Kramer was by the paper cutter with Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins and a folded document in his hand. He had sent for us with the air of a man holding something heavy and unclean, and the thing turned out to be both useful and official. Wolf drew a straight line on the plaster wall of the workroom, set marks on it, and wrote times beneath them in a square, precise hand. 30, he said. Dinner on Lexington with an unknown companion. Approximately 11:15 to 11:30, Elias Vane is shot. After midnight. His voice begins a social engagement. It could not physically attend. He added them one by one. 12:21 Dykes, 12:25, Loring 12:28, Bimmel, 12:30, Mrs. Tebbett, 12:34, Miss Vane, Mr. Haffin's hearing of departure, somewhere in the same vicinity. Kramer grunted. That's the part we know. No, Wolf said. That is the part you have memorized. Now the part you brought. Kramer handed him the paper. Wolf read it, passed it to me, and I read Municipal Archive Annex, Center Street. Receipt for sealed packet. Collected 12:46 a.m. signed, Elias Vane. He looked up. That's awkward. With him dead and all. Exactly, Kramer said. Night clerk remembers the name, said the man had Vane's trade card. Signed neat. Kept his hat low, and took a locked archive parcel wrapped in brown paper and cord, restricted material. Old club permits, guest rosters, nuisance complaints, supplementary receipts, Queen's lantern all over it. Wolf put another mark on the wall. 12:46. The dead man acquires paperwork. He stepped back and looked at the timeline as if it were a badly printed menu. There the 2 hours are purchased, I said. The fake calls weren't only to confuse time of death. They kept Elias alive in circulation. Yes, Wolf said. Not in body, on paper. That pleased him more than it did Kramer. So somebody needed his name active after midnight, I said. Not just his voice. Precisely. The witnesses do not merely postpone his death. They create a movable Elias Vane, one who is leaving town, paying rent, finding ledgers, warning visitors away, directing private acts. Such a man may also sign for a parcel. Kramer crossed his arms. The clerk says he would swear it was Vane if you pressed him. Wolf snorted. Then do not press him midnight. Overcoat, hat brim, a familiar name, a trade card, and a signature glimpsed after rain and boredom. Clerks identify expectation more reliably than men. I looked again at the receipt. What was in the parcel when you opened it? Nothing useful, Kramer said sourly. Empty wrappers, one inventory slip, and marks where papers had been removed. So the killer gets the archive packet, strips it, and the city thinks Elias did it, I said. Yes, Wolf said, which means the calls had to be distributed before any inquiry connected to the archive could harden. By morning, if needed, witnesses could place Elias alive after midnight. The paper life covers the paper theft. Purley, who had been listening with the patience of a decent man trapped among professionals, said, then maybe the archive packet was the real point. Wolf turned his head. Sergeant, that is so intelligent you should avoid doing it too often in front of your superiors. Kramer pretended not to hear because it was true enough to sting. I walked the room once, looking from the chalk marks to the desk in the front office where the dictation machine had stood, then back to the little rear room with the kettle, cups, and cedar trace. So while one person may have been using Elias on telephones and in records, somebody was still here after the murder, I said. Or the same man moved efficiently, Wolf said, but I distrust efficiency in rich suspects unless assisted. That points to Fenwick again. It points, Wolf said, to someone who knew three things. Elias had been at the archive before. Elias's name would open doors there, and the seized packet mattered enough to justify a manufactured resurrection. Kramer jabbed a finger toward the timeline. Then which came first? The archive pickup, or the phone tricks? The need came first, Wolf said. The calls are the purchase price. That sat with me. Murder had not ended Elias Vane's usefulness. It had monetized it, I said, and the parcel was locked. Yes, Kramer said. Archive cord and tin seal when handed over. Meaning whoever picked it up couldn't know for certain what was inside until afterward. Wolf's eyes narrowed. Good, therefore, the pickup may have been exploratory, not specific. The murderer knew the archive held related material, not necessarily which item would prove dangerous. Then why risk so much for it? I asked. Because Elias Vane's death had made delay impossible. If Elias had found the ledger or a route to it, then every old paper connected to the Queen's lantern became urgent. Wolf stared at the wall again. Chalk times dead man, false voice. Archive receipt. Then he made one more mark, not on the line, but beneath it. Question, he said. What question? I asked. Why tell Miss Vane that the ledger had been found under the street if the archive parcel was the true object of the purchased hours? Kramer said. To send her hunting the wrong place. Perhaps, Wolf said. But perhaps also because by then the ledger had indeed been found, and the archive packet was sought only to interpret or suppress it. That improved the case while worsening everybody in it. On the drive back uptown, I said. So Elias dies before midnight, but his shadow signs for a parcel at 12:46. Yes. And if the city archive had challenged the signature, they did not. And the witnesses guaranteed nobody would doubt he was still moving around. Yes, then whoever staged the calls did not need a living man. Wolf settled deeper into the seat and shut his eyes. Number only a legally convenient one. Back at the brownstone, Fritz had lunch waiting, because civilization must defend itself where it can. While Wolf ate and I drank coffee, I kept seeing the chalk line on the print shop wall. Time of death on one end, false life on the other, and in between two bought hours, where a dead printer walked through official paper by borrowed permission. That was when the case changed shape again. Murder was only the first act. The real transaction was documentary. Elias Vane had been killed, then used. His voice had carried him through telephones. His name had carried him through the archive. And somewhere behind both was a locked parcel and a ledger that frightened the children of old respectable sinners. Wolf finished his coffee and said, Archie. Yes, sir. This afternoon we find out who at the archive knew Elias Vane by sight, who could imitate his signature, and who among our excellent suspects understands that paper, unlike men, can be murdered twice. That was Wolf at his most wolfish. Exact, sour, and already half a move ahead of the rest of us. Chapter 7. The ledger under the street. The torn receipt in Elias's fist matched a storage claim from an abandoned tram tunnel beneath Riddle Street. A place older than maps and quieter than prayer. There Wolf found the missing parcel. Inside it a ledger of payments linking councilmen, contractors, and shell owners to the demolition of half the East Block. Elias had been printing fake notices to expose a land seizure buried under legal stamps and public silence. The killer was not protecting a secret murder. The killer was protecting a future fortune. The next morning began with one of those rare spectacles that make a household pause in respect. Nero Wolf came downstairs from the plant rooms before time and announced that he was going out twice in one day. Fritz, who was setting coffee on the office table, stopped with the pot in midair. I put down my notebook and looked at Wolf to see whether the strain had injured him. You heard me, Wolf said. Archie, put away that expression. It is uncivil. I'm saving it for the papers. You will save nothing for the papers. We are going to Riddle Street. Again. Yes, and below it. That earned my full attention. Inspector Kramer had telephoned at 8:40 with a report from the archive annex and another from a clerk in the Department of Transit Records, who had done what clerks do best when properly bullied, produced a forgotten map. It showed that beneath the east side of Riddle Street, cut off and bricked over when trolley lines were revised before the war, there ran a short abandoned tram tunnel with 2 storage recesses and an old maintenance entrance disguised, now as a concrete patch and iron hatch inside a locked basement on the block. That connected beautifully with the torn receipt strip Elias Vane had died clutching. Not a restaurant receipt at all, though it had played one in dim light and bad reasoning. The figures matched a municipal storage claim format, once used for reclaimed transit property. The tail end of the printed line I had wanted to read as Lexington had turned out, under proper enlargement and shame, to be municipal transit storage. Wolf had not reproached me. He merely looked at me for 3 seconds over breakfast, which was worse. So at 10:15 we were on Riddle Street again, with Kramer, Pearlie, a transit custodian named Worth, and one city welder, who objected to everything except overtime. The East Block looked harmless in daylight, which is one of New York's meaner tricks. The butcher was at work next door. The print shop stood shut and sullen. Across the street, a row of older buildings leaned together like men sharing a bad secret. The basement access was in the rear of a vacant Notions warehouse 2 doors down from Blackbriar Prints. The warehouse owner had been discovered in Jersey and persuaded over the telephone that municipal necessity outranked his objections. The iron hatch lay under stacked crates and 2 generations of dust. When Worth swung it open, stale air came up as if the city had exhaled through old teeth. "I object," Wolf said. "Noted," I told him. He glared. "If I fall on those steps, Archie, I shall dismiss you with my last breath. That seems wasteful." The stair went down into brick dampness and old echo. I went first with Pearlie and a flashlight, then Kramer, then Wolf, descending with immense caution and the expression of a monarch forced into mining. The tram tunnel was not large, only a side spur really, running 20 yards under the block before it ended in a bricked curve. Rails still showed under the dirt in places. Water dripped somewhere beyond sight. Sound behaved oddly there. Even Kramer's breathing acquired a municipal solemnity. "Older than maps," I said. "Nothing is older than maps," Wolf muttered, "only more neglected." Halfway down the spur we found the first storage recess, empty except for broken crate wood, rusted brackets and a dead bottle. The second recess had a steel cage gate, padlocked. On the floor nearby, under muck and dust, I saw a scuff mark freshly made across the grime, and a triangle of brown wrapping paper caught on the corner of a brick. "Here," I said. Pearlie put his light on it. The padlock was newer than anything else in the place. Kramer looked at Worth. "Yours." Worth shook his head. "No city lock." The welder took care of it with noise and sparks, which Wolf bore like a martyr in a boiler factory. Inside the cage stood one rectangular parcel wrapped in brown paper, tied with archive string, transit storage tag attached. The paper had been opened and reclosed once. The tin seal was broken. Kramer let out a breath. "There." "No," Wolf said. "Not there. Here." He was looking not at the parcel, but at the dust on the shelf behind it. 2 rectangles had rested there. "Only one remained," I said. "Somebody already took one." "Yes." Kramer swore in a concise official manner. "Open this." He did not wait for volunteers. He cut the string. Inside was the locked archive case from Center Street, or what had been locked. The case itself had been forced. Its contents were partly there and partly absent. On top lay guest rosters of the Queen's Lantern, permit copies, nuisance complaints from neighbors, and bundled vouchers. Beneath them was a ledger, not the big theatrical sort with brass corners, but a narrow black account book, cheap and deadly. Wolf took it first. His heavy fingers were delicate with paper. He opened halfway, read 2 pages, then another, and handed it to me without comment. It was ugly reading. Dates, initials, street parcels, payments to shell owners, notes marked against council committee actions, demolition awards, delayed code citations, emergency repairs, transfer fees. Across several pages, the same East Block addresses recurred, including the properties on Riddle Street. Men had been paid to condemn buildings cheaply, frighten tenants, reroute notices, and clear titles under the cover of public safety. One page listed contractors beside campaign subscriptions, another cross, indexed shell companies to a future redevelopment corporation, not yet public, but very much alive. I said, "This isn't club scandal, it's land." "Yes," Wolf said. Kramer took the ledger, read, and his face changed from anger to something better fed. "Councilmen, contractors, dummy owners. Good God," Pearlie said softly. "Half the East Block." "Not half," Wolf said. "The profitable half." That was the first full turn of the screw. The Queen's Lantern had survived beyond dinners and discreet wickedness into business. Old favors had become modern real estate. Elias Vane had not merely been poking at dead reputations. He had put his hand into a future fortune. In the parcel under the ledger was another packet, printed notices, fresh and unmailed. In Blackbriar's type, I took one out and read it. Notice of structural condemnation and immediate vacancy, city format. City wording. City seal imitated well enough to fool frightened tenants on a hallway. Glance. Kramer stared. Fake notices. Wolf nodded. Elias Vane was printing them. To do what? I asked. Interrupt the swindle, Wolf said, or expose it by forcing reaction. If tenants received false notices before the official ones, the discrepancy would flush out the mechanism. Men stealing a block by paperwork do not enjoy premature paperwork. I turned over another sheet. Handwritten on the back in Elias's narrow script were 2 words, proof first. Which fits him, I said. Yes, Wolf said. He wanted evidence before noise. Kramer was paging rapidly now. Rudolph Fenwick's old company here, and a new one, Fenwick Urban Holdings. Paul's on that board. There it was, plain as a slap. The killer had not been protecting an old murder, or even merely an old vice. He had been protecting a land seizure dressed in permits and silence, with enough money in it to make murder look economical. Pearlie, practical as ever, pointed to the shelf behind the parcel. What was in the missing package? Wolf looked at the ledger again. Probably the duplicate Elias intended to make, or the companion papers identifying current beneficiaries more plainly than this does, Archie. I knew what he wanted because by then I had found it too. Tucked in the inside cover was a folded claim slip in Elias's hand with a notation, 1 original, 1 copy to T if necessary. I said. Kramer's head came up. Tebbit. Probably, Wolf said. Mrs. Tebbit, not Transit. I grinned. Good, I was afraid we'd have to question the streetcars. Wolf ignored me. He was staring down the tunnel, past us into the dark where the rails vanished. The receipt in Elias's hand was not a dinner clue, he said. It was a claim check. He held on to it because it led here. He may have realized at the instant of attack that the murderer wanted it. Kramer snapped the ledger shut. Then Fenwick kills Vane, searches the shop, gets the note about the tunnel, uses Vane's voice to buy time, pulls the archive packet in Vane's name, and comes down here for the rest. Or sends someone, Wolf said. Do not grow lazy because the outline flatters you. Kramer grunted. He hates being corrected most when the correction is sound. We brought the parcel, ledger, and notices up into daylight, where even corruption looks more ordinary than it deserves. On the curb, by the vacant warehouse, Wolf paused, breathing the cold air as if it were medicine after burial. Well, I said, our dead printer had a larger hobby than club gossip. He had a conscience complicated by method, Wolf said. He intended exposure, but only after securing proof. That made him admirable and fatal. Kramer tucked the ledger under his arm like a weapon. I'll get warrants. No, Wolf said. Kramer stopped. What? Not yet. If you move now, you will frighten every rat in the wall and recover only speeches. We need the second packet, the duplicate, and the person who thought the future fortune worth murder. Kramer stared. You still need the person. Yes, do keep up. He looked ready to burst, but Pearlie said mildly, He's right, Inspector. Back at the brownstone, with the ledger in Wolf's safe and Fritz, outraged by mud on the hall runner, the shape of the case finally stood upright. Elias Vane had found more than an old shame. He had found a live machine of theft, working through condemned buildings, shell owners, bought approvals, and silence. The Queen's Lantern names mattered, only because they connected the old network to the new one. Rudolph Fenwick had belonged to the first. Paul Fenwick meant to profit from the second. Over lunch, Wolf said very little. He ate cold sliced duck, beet salad, and cheese in the reflective silence he reserves for moments when the facts have become cleaner than the people. I let him alone until coffee. Future fortune, I said. Yes. Not protecting what had been done, protecting what was about to be gained. Exactly. Murder is often retrospective. This one is prospective. That makes it both uglier and more hopeful. Hopeful? Yes, because men defending tomorrow's profit are more likely to blunder today. I thought of the missing second rectangle on the tunnel shelf. And the duplicate? Wolf set down his cup. That is the heart now. Elias noted one copy to tea if necessary. If Mrs. Tebbit has it, she may be in danger. If she does not, then someone believes she does. Either way, by tonight, we must have everyone in this room who has lied, feared, inherited, or washed with cedar soap. That was Wolf at the point I like best. Fat, immovable, and more dangerous than motion. The tunnel under Riddle Street had yielded the buried motive, murder for land, fraud by paper, a dead printer who had tried to answer it with type, proof, and a duplicate yet to be found. The killer, I thought, had made one grand mistake. He had assumed Elias Vane was only guarding a secret. He had been guarding an investment, and investments make people reckless. Chapter 8. The man who needed tomorrow. All roads now bent toward Nolan Creed, Elias's business partner, a man with polished shoes and the patience of mold. Paul Fenwick had motive, money, and a stake in the future block. Creed had proximity, access, insurance, and the nerve to turn that larger pressure into a personal murder. Creed stood to inherit the shop, collect a payoff from the redevelopment syndicate, and use Elias's supposed midnight calls as proof that Elias handled the archive theft alone after business hours. He had access to the dictation machine, the witness list, and the cedar soap lingering in the locked room. Most of all, he had need, the oldest and least original weapon on Riddle Street. At 3 that afternoon, Nero Wolfe sent for Nolan Creed. By then the division had become plain enough even to me. Fenwick wanted Elias delayed, bought, or frightened off. Creed wanted him gone, because Creed's own future sat directly on the corpse. He did not say, "Bring him here." Wolfe is too civilized to issue commands in crude form when a polished one will do. He told me to telephone Mr. Creed and inform him that since his name had become unavoidable, his presence in the office at 4:30 would be the least disagreeable course left open to him. That was Wolfe's phrasing. Mine, delivered over the wire, was shorter and better suited to immediate digestion. Nolan Creed arrived at 4:26, which told me he valued punctuality when it was safer than defiance. He was around 45, smooth where Elias Vane had been sharp, full where Elias had been spare, and so carefully dressed that the crease in his trousers looked capable of testimony. He had polished black shoes, a dark blue suit, too good for honest printing, and a pale tie arranged with the sort of attention that often replaces conscience in middle age. His hair was dark and exact. His eyes were not. They moved quickly and returned slowly, as if each object in a room might be converted into advantage, if given time. He saw Kramer first, sitting square and red in the yellow chair by the Globe, and then Clara Tebbit, and then Stephen Loring, and finally Wolfe behind the desk, who did not rise because mountains do not stand to receive quarries. "Mr. Wolfe," Creed said. "Inspector, I was told this was urgent." "It is," Wolfe said. "Sit down." Creed sat, not too quickly, not too slowly. He crossed one leg over the other and laid his hat neatly beside him. That kind of neatness in a suspect is either training or fear wearing training's coat. I took the chair at my desk and got my pencil ready. Mara Vane had not yet arrived. Paul Fenwick had not yet been invited. Wolfe was building in layers, as he likes to do when he intends the room to work for him before he works on it. "You were Elias Vane's partner?" Wolfe asked. Creed inclined his head. "In the business name only, these past 2 years. Blackbriar Prince was mostly Elias's operation. I handled outside accounts, deliveries, some private contracts." "Private contracts," Wolfe said. "An elastic phrase. In our trade, necessarily. Were you fond of Mr. Vane?" Creed gave a small, careful smile. "Fond is not a business term." "No," Wolfe said. "It is often a funeral one." Creed let that pass. We respected each other's value. I said, "Did you respect his habit of being murdered?" His eyes came to me. "Mr. Goodwin, I'm not certain whether that was wit." It wasn't I was saving my wit. Wolf lifted a finger, and I subsided. Not because Creed deserved courtesy, but because Wolf wanted the man to grow into his own rope. You knew, Wolf said, that Elias had been examining old Queen's Lantern papers. Yes, you disapproved. I considered it unhealthy. Why? Because dead scandals are like open drains. One may satisfy curiosity and still poison the street. Clara Tebbit spoke for the first time. That sounds prepared. Creed turned toward her with smooth surprise. Mrs. Tebbit. She held his gaze. Mr. Creed. There was history there, or at least recognition with edges, Wolf said. You visited the shop on the night Elias died. Creed did not even blink. Number, that was too clean. You dined with him that evening. Number your answer, Wolf murmured. Has the air of having been laundered. I distrust laundered answers. Creed's mouth tightened by less than a quarter inch. I have told you the truth. I reached to my blotter and slid a photograph across the desk. It showed the second tunnel shelf beneath Riddle Street, the dust rectangle, where one parcel had been removed, and the ledger parcel beside it. Creed looked at it, and in that instant, he made his first mistake. He looked not at the parcel that had been found, but at the empty place where the missing one had stood. Only for a second, but I saw it, and Wolf saw that I saw it. Wolf said mildly, interesting. Creed turned back. I don't know what I'm looking at. No, Wolf said. That is incorrect. You looked at exactly what was no longer there. Creed gave a short laugh. If that is your method, Mr. Wolf, I hope your orchids are less imaginative. Wolf's eyes half closed. Leave my orchids out of your vulgarities. Kramer grunted approval. Creed shifted slightly in the chair. Not much, but enough to alter the creases in his trousers. Fear had begun to sit down beside him. Wolf folded his hands. Mr. Creed, Elias Vane found evidence that the redevelopment of the East Block around Riddle Street was being manipulated through false condemnations, shell owners, paid approvals, and advance transfers. He printed imitation city notices, not for profit, but to force exposure. He located a ledger and related archive materials. He was then murdered. After his death, his voice was used to suggest continued activity, and a sealed archive packet was collected in his name at 12:46 in the morning. At this point, we are beyond privacy and close to arithmetic. Therefore, I ask you again, did you dine with him that evening? Creed looked at Wolf steadily. Numbered. Did you know of the tunnel under Riddle Street? Numbered, did you know of the archive request? Number. Did you know he kept a dictation machine? A pause. Yes. That one mattered because he had denied all the rest without pause. You had access to it. I worked in the office. Did you know where he kept old cylinders? Yes. Did you know the witness list, the people he might telephone or trust? He was not secretive in ordinary matters. Did you use cedar soap? There it was. Creed actually smiled. It was a neat smile and almost good. That, he said, is a remarkable question. Yes. I use soap. I have not catalogued its moral implications, Clara Tebbit said quietly. Cedar, from Morelands on Madison. Creed's head turned sharply, not because the name surprised him, but because she had it. Wolf's eyes opened wider. Indeed. Clara kept her gaze on Creed. He gave it to Elias once at Christmas. 2 years ago, said a printer should occasionally remember he is human. Creed said, this is absurd. No, Clara said, merely inconvenient. That helped. Not enough, but usefully. Mara Vane arrived then, late and cold, eyed, saw Creed in the room, and stopped only long enough to let her contempt show. Of course. Creed rose halfway, thought better of it, and sat again. Miss Vane. My brother disliked you, she said. I'm sorry your grief encourages fiction. My grief, she replied, encourages memory. Wolf let that settle before speaking. Miss Vane, did Elias ever say what would happen to the shop if he died? Yes. Mr. Creed would attempt to inherit what he had not built. Creed snapped. That is nonsense. We had an agreement. Wolf turned. Produce it. Creed checked himself. I can do so, I said, and meanwhile the redevelopment syndicate would be pleased to deal with a smoother partner than Elias. Creed looked at me. You have a melodramatic turn, Mr. Goodwin. Only when the facts dress up. Kramer leaned forward. Creed, you were on the books for consultation payments from Halcyon Urban Renewal. There. The room got tighter. Creed said. That was legitimate. Was it? Kramer asked. Halcyon links to Fenwick interests through 2 shells and a law office. Creed's face remained composed, but his right hand had closed on the chair arm. Wolf said, So, you are not the architect, perhaps, but you are employed by the weather. Creed ignored him and turned to Kramer. I advised on print notices and tenant communications. That is all. Mara gave a hard little laugh. False notices. Number. Then why did Elias keep samples in the tunnel? That one landed clean. Creed looked at her, then at Wolf, and for a moment I thought he might finally choose a bad answer over none. But he held it. Wolf said, Mr. Creed, you had access to the shop, to the dictation machine, to Elias's files, to the witness names, and to the redevelopment men who stood to gain if he were removed. Mr. Fenwick supplied pressure and future profit. You supplied access, method, and appetite. You also had something else. Creed said nothing. Need, Wolf said. The oldest and least original motive in commerce. Elias was obstructing a future payoff. His continued life endangered tomorrow's money. Creed's voice came out flatter now. Need is not murder. No, Wolf said, but it hires murder, arranges it, or stands nearby pretending surprise. Clara Tebbit leaned forward slightly. Ask him about the partnership insurance. I turned to her. So did everybody else. Creed's face changed. Not much enough, Wolf said. Excellent. Mrs. Tebbit, she kept her eyes on Creed. Yes. My late husband knew enough of the old club to make Elias trust me, with what he could not yet bring to the police. Elias told me last month that Creed had urged him to increase the business life insurance because outside contracts were growing. If Elias died, the surviving partner would receive operating control and immediate liquidity. Kramer muttered, How much? Creed said. Too quickly. Standard coverage. Mara said, 40,000. Creed turned on her. You don't know what you're talking about, she said. I found the premium notices in Elias's desk. That was the third mistake, though he had not made it. The room had made it for him. Creed's denial now had too many corners. Wolf did not move. So, the shop, the payoff from redevelopment communications, insurance liquidity, and Elias's apparent sole responsibility for the archive theft, if the false midnight trail held, very tidy. Creed stood up. This is outrageous. You have suspicion, gossip, and a dead man's eccentric notes. Nothing more. Wolf nodded. Not yet enough for handcuffs, perhaps, but more than enough for tomorrow's gathering. Creed stared. What gathering? The one in this office at 6 tomorrow evening, Wolf said. You will attend with Mr. Fenwick, Mrs. Tebbit, Miss Vane, Mr. Loring, Mr. Dykes, if he can still walk, and Inspector Kramer, if he can still breathe. By then I shall be in a better mood and you in a worse one. Creed let out one short, hard breath through his nose. I won't be summoned like a clerk. Wolf's voice dropped. Mr. Creed, if you fail me now, Kramer will not. Consider which of us you find less disagreeable. Creed looked at Kramer. That helped. He put on his hat with exact fingers and left without another word. When the door closed, I said. He looked at the empty place on the shelf. Yes. He knew the cedar soap. Yes. He had motive enough to choke a horse. Yes. And he lied as if he had paid in advance. Yes. I spread my hands, then what are we waiting for? Wolf settled back in his chair. For the second parcel, for the duplicate, for Mr. Fenwick to discover whether he is being protected or betrayed. and for one inconsistency in Mr. Creed's elegant little arrangement. What inconsistency? Wolf closed his eyes. If Creed killed Elias to secure tomorrow, why did he let Mrs. Tebbit live after the call instructing her to burn the envelope? A cautious criminal closes all dangerous drawers. Clara answered that one before I could. Because he believed I had only old club papers. Wolf opened one eye. Or because you had something he still hoped to recover without noise. Mara said. The duplicate. Yes, Wolf said. The room went quiet then, the useful kind of quiet, not the empty one, outside. Traffic moved through the late afternoon with the steady indifference of the city. Inside, the case had narrowed from conspiracy to person. Not entirely, not comfortably, but enough. Nolan Creed had shoes too polished for grief, hands too clean for innocence, and tomorrow leaning on him like debt. Wolf looked at each of us in turn and said, Tonight nobody goes anywhere alone. Mrs. Tebbit returns here for dinner and remains under this roof if she has sense. Miss Vane may do as she likes, though I advise against heroics. Archie, telephone Mr. Fenwick and tell him I have at last learned something to his advantage. He will come out of vanity, if not fear. That's bait. Yes, Wolf said. Use a better tone than the fish deserves. And that was the shape of it at the end of the 8th chapter, the business partner with need, the heir with profit, the widow with papers, the sister with memory, and Wolf at the center, huge and still, waiting for tomorrow to bring the one thing murderers always imagine they can postpone, not justice. Only the moment when their own arrangement begins to speak against them. Chapter 9, the lock that opened inward. Wolf returned to the print shop and showed the constable the trick. The back bolt could be lifted from outside, through the receipt slot, using a printer's steel rule, then dropped back into place after the door closed. The locked room was never sealed. It was staged, just like the cause, just like Elias's borrowed tomorrow, when confronted with the wax cylinder, the storage receipt, and the archive signature forged in Elias's hand. Creed did what weak men always do when cornered by structure. He stopped denying details and started explaining motives. At 11 the next morning, Nero Wolf committed his second excursion in 24 hours, which for him approaches moral heroism. He had spent breakfast in sour reflection, lunch in disciplined silence, and 10 minutes after lunch standing in the office with his eyes closed and one forefinger against his lip, which is one of the outward signs that his mind has stopped collecting and begun arranging furniture. Then he said, Archie, Riddle Street. I put down the insurance memorandum I had been reading and got my hat. To arrest architecture. To rebuke it. Inspector Kramer met us at Blackbriar Prints with Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins, and the constable who had first answered Loring's alarm on the night. Elias Vane was found. The constable was a square, sober man named Hanley, with the sort of face that makes facts feel welcome. I approved of him at once, because he looked as if he had never improved a detail in his life. The shop had the same weary, daytime look. Front office, workroom, backroom. Too much paper, too little innocence. Wolf did not pause to dislike it. He went directly to the rear door, inspected the inside bolt, the mail slot cut low in the wood, and the metal guide strip for deliveries. Kramer said, You've seen the door? Yes, Wolf said. Now I understand it. That got my attention. It got Kramer's too, though he tried not to show it because he prefers revelation only when issued by the police department. Wolf turned to me. The steel rule. I handed him the long, flexible printer's rule we had brought from the front office drawer, thin as a blade and twice as mean. Looking, he held it up. A printer, he said, works with odd lengths of thin steel. He also works with slots, guides, and hinges. That the police did not immediately suspect the door of professional collaboration is regrettable, but not surprising. Kramer grunted. Show it. Wolf did not himself stoop. He handed the rule to me and instructed. The slot, inward angle first. Lift under the bolt tongue. Archie, through the slot, then up. I went down on one knee and slid the rule through the narrow receipt slot, cut near the jamb. Then angled it upward inside the gap between door and casing. It took me 2 tries because the position was awkward, and the door had swollen a fraction from damp, but on the third, I felt metal touch metal. Got it. Lift. I lifted. Inside, the bolt rose with a small discreet click. Pearlie let out a breath. Kramer muttered something official and brief. Now open the door, Wolf said. I did. The bolt stayed up, Wolf pointed. And, after closing, I closed it again and withdrew the rule slowly, letting the bolt slip back by gravity into its socket. It dropped home with a neat final sound that would have pleased a cabinet maker and ruined a locked room theory. The constable Hanley said, "Well, I'll be damned." "No," Wolf said, "only corrected." Kramer stared at the door as if it had cheated in public. "That means the back entrance could be secured from outside." "Yes, and the room was never sealed. Number it was dressed." I leaned on the jamb and grinned. Like the calls, like the archive life, like the whole dead man after midnight circus. Wolf nodded once. Exactly. The room was not impossible, it was cooperative. That cleaned the case another step. The murderer had never been trapped inside. He had needed only a printer's tool, and the assurance that policemen, confronted by a bolted door, would admire the bolt more than the slot. That was not a miracle. It was contempt. Kramer turned to Hanley. "You hear that slot move the night you were here?" Hanley shook his head. Rain, street noise, and I was at the front by then. "Of course," Wolf said. "It required no noise worth memory." He moved to the front office and indicated the desk. "Now assemble it." I knew what he meant. Elias Vane is dead before midnight. The killer searches the office, accesses the dictation machine, perhaps carries cylinders away or prepares fragments. He exits by the back, secures the bolt with the steel rule, uses the same method or a key for the front as needed, and leaves the scene locked enough to satisfy romantic minds. Then elsewhere, the dead man continues his errands by voice and by signature. Kramer said, "All right, we've got entry and exit, we've got staging. I can take Creed." "No," Wolf said. Kramer swung. "Why not?" "Because he will explain only what helps him unless the explanation costs more than silence." "And you think you can arrange that?" "Yes." That answer irritated Kramer because it was both arrogant and correct. We went back to the brownstone with the steel rule in my pocket and the door trick in our heads. On the drive uptown, I said, "So Creed leaves by the back, drops the bolt, and the locked room is a tailor's dummy." "Yes." "And if he had a key to the front, he had business access. And the witness list, the dictation machine, and the archive reason." "Yes. Then what's left?" Wolf shut his eyes. "The moment he discovers that his elegant structure now excludes him instead of protecting him." That came at 6 in the office, with the company assembled as Wolf had ordained. Clara Tebbett in black and composure, Mara Vane severe and bright-eyed, Stephen Loring tight and pale, Paul Fenwick wearing expensive control and not enough of it, Nolan Creed with polished shoes and a face scrubbed of expression so carefully that expression had simply retreated inward, Lewis Dykes, unexpectedly present and wrapped in enough scarf to suggest either age or theatrical spite, Inspector Kramer by the Globe, Pearlie near the door, Fritz nowhere visible, and therefore, by Fritz's rules, managing civilization in the background. Wolf sat behind his desk, huge and still, with beer at his elbow and disgust equally distributed. He began without ceremony. "The locked room aspect of Elias Vane's murder has been resolved. The rear bolt at Blackbriar Prints can be manipulated from outside through the receipt slot with a printer's steel rule. Mr. Goodwin demonstrated it this afternoon. Therefore the room was staged, not sealed. Creed did not move. Fenwick did. Slightly Loring sucked in breath through his nose. Dykes murmured, "Ah," with the satisfaction of a man who likes drama when he is not responsible for it. Wolf continued. The false post, midnight calls were likewise staged. They did not originate from Vane's line. His voice had been borrowed from his dictation records after Julian Haft refused to perform the trick. Creed used those fragments to coach himself into a rough but sufficient imitation for brief calls, preserving Vane's characteristic pause between clauses and relying on poor late-night telephone lines to do the rest. That borrowed voice prolonged his paper existence. During that extension, a sealed archive parcel was collected in his name at 12:46 a.m. He nodded to me. I passed the wax cylinder box, the enlarged storage claim fragment, and the archive receipt copy in order. They went first to Kramer, then by degrees around the room like contagious truth. The cylinder, Wolf said, contains Elias Vane's voice in fragments, including phrases heard by witnesses. The storage claim in Vane's hand led to the abandoned tram tunnel beneath Riddle Street, where one parcel remained and one had already been removed. The archive receipt bears Vane's forged signature. Paul Fenwick said sharply. Forged by whom? Wolf turned his head. Patience, Mr. Fenwick. You have spent years profiting from arrangements. Spend 2 more minutes enduring one. Fenwick reddened. Creed remained still. Wolf pressed on. Inside the tunnel parcel were records linking old Queen's Lantern connections to present redevelopment fraud, paid condemnations, shell ownership, manipulated notices, and future profit in the East Block seizure. Elias Vane discovered this and prepared false city notices not for gain, but to flush the scheme into daylight, Mara Vane said. Yes, be quiet, Wolf told her. She was. Then he looked at Creed. Mr. Creed had access to the shop, the office, the dictation machine, the witness names, the business insurance, and the redevelopment interests. Mr. Fenwick had reason to want Elias silenced, but not the intimate access needed to stage Elias's habits from the inside. He also had need. Elias Vane's death promised him operating, control of the shop, insurance liquidity, and removal of an obstructive partner from a profitable future transaction. Creed said evenly. This is inference. Yes, Wolf said. Now detail. You dined with Elias that evening, under pretense of reconciling some portion of the Halcyon Communications contract. He returned with you or before you to the shop in the back room. Coffee was made, hence the kettle and 2 chairs. You knew the old cedar soap because you had once given it to him and later used it there yourself. At some point you shot him from behind in the workroom. He seized the storage claim strip because he knew what you wanted. You searched the office, found or confirmed the tunnel reference and the dictation materials, exited by the rear, and secured the bolt from outside with a printer's rule. Creed spoke for the first time. Number Wolf ignored him. Then you used Elias's prepared voice to extend his life through witnesses. You did not need a gifted mimic, only short phrases, the wax fragments, a bad line, and the confidence to lean on the pause listeners already associated with Vane. The purpose was twofold. To keep Loring away from the shop, Mrs. Tebbit from examining her envelope, and various others occupied or impressed, and to permit Elias Vane to remain active on paper while the archive packet was collected in his name. Creed said, louder. Number Wolf's eyes narrowed. Do not interrupt to repeat a syllable already disproved by facts. Kramer leaned forward. The archive clerk will identify you. Creed turned on him. He will identify a coat and a hat. Also your caution, Wolf said. And perhaps your handwriting, though that matters less. Creed's control shifted then. It did not crack. Exactly. It refined itself into something narrower and more dangerous. You are all very pleased, he said. But you still have no witness to the shooting. No, Wolf said, because murderers prefer privacy. No one saw me at the archive. No one needed to, once the structure is complete. No one can prove I made those calls. Possibly not all of them, but enough. Creed stood up. Then this is performance. That was when Wolf delivered the piece he had been saving. Yes, he said, and you know much about performance. Enough, for instance, to begin denying details only until denial becomes useless. After that, weak men explain motives. Creed stared at him. Wolf's voice stayed mild. You did not kill Elias Vane for old scandal. You killed him because he had moved from history into profit. He was about to expose a live land seizure worth more than reputation. You need it tomorrow, Elias obstructed it. Something went out of Creed's face then. Not color, not courage, exactly, but the energy required to keep his lies upright. He sat down again. Clara Tebbit made a small sound, almost not audible. Mara Vane gripped the chair arms. Fenwick looked at Creed with the quick predatory disgust of a man discovering he may have been outplayed by a subordinate. Dykes closed his eyes briefly, perhaps in boredom, perhaps in pity, though I would not swear to either. Creed said without looking at anyone, "You don't understand what Elias was doing." Wolf's brows moved. "Ah." Kramer shifted forward. Pearlie took one silent step nearer the door. Creed went on, still not denying now, only shaping. He was not a reformer. He was going to use it. He wanted leverage first. He said he would force them to halt the block transfer unless certain names were exposed publicly and certain others paid to disappear. He thought he could control it. "That," Wolf said, "does not improve your position." "No," Creed said, "but it improves your picture." It did. And there it was, the turn from denial to explanation. Wolf had named the motive, and Creed, cornered by structure, had chosen the smaller ruin. He was trying to become less guilty by making the dead man less pure. It seldom works, but men try it with touching regularity. "You admit the meeting," Wolf said. Creed's mouth moved. "Yes, you admit the argument." "Yes. You admit knowledge of the tunnel papers and the redevelopment value." "Yes. You admit Elias intended to pressure the syndicate." "Yes. And you admit," Kramer snapped, "that you were there when he died." Creed looked up at last. "I was there." That was enough for Kramer. It should have been enough for anyone. But Wolf, because he was Wolf, was not finished. He wanted the whole shape, not merely the broken edge. He said, "Tell it." Creed swallowed once. "We had coffee in the back. He showed me a draft of one of the fake condemnation notices and said by the following week, half the block would know enough to panic, and the other half would start paying to prevent it. He talked about proof, copies, insurance, leverage. He said Fenwick would bend first, that Loring would squirm, that Mrs. Tebbit would despise him, and still be useful. He went into the workroom to fetch something. Maybe the claim slip. Maybe the ledger note. I followed. I had the gun. I had brought it because I thought he might threaten me physically." Dykes opened one eye. "Printers are fearsome." Creed ignored him. He turned. He saw it. He reached for the claim strip on the desk, just grabbed it, as if even then he meant to keep me from the tunnel, and I fired. "Silence," then Kramer said, "and the rest." Creed shut his eyes. I knew at once what it meant if the tunnel papers, the duplicate, and the archive papers surfaced. I searched. I found the machine, the witness names, the storage reference. I thought if Elias could still seem alive after midnight, then the archive pickup could look like his own panic. I had already talked to Fenwick about the block. He wanted delay, not murder. I did not tell him what I was about to do. Fenwick exploded. "You filthy little." "Silence," Wolf barked, and for once the room obeyed with instant decency. Creed went on, voice flatter now, spent, "I used the rule on the back bolt. Later, I collected the archive packet. Then I went under the street. The ledger was there, so were Vane's copies or notes. I don't know what all he had. I took the parcel that seemed to matter most, and the duplicate I found with it. I left the other because I heard someone above and thought I could return." Mara said, barely above a whisper, "You murdered him for a block of buildings." Creed turned to her. "Number for what comes after." Wolf's face hardened. "There speaks every cheap destroyer in a city of expensive ones." Kramer rose. "That's enough." It was Pearlie moved in. Creed did not resist. Men like him usually do not, once the words are out. Resistance requires the same confidence as lying, and both had left him. When the door closed behind Kramer, Pearlie, and Nolan Creed. The office let out one long invisible breath. Fritz appeared exactly then with beer for Wolf and coffee for the rest of us, because Fritz understands rhythm better than actors or murderers. Wolf took his glass, looked at Fenwick, Loring, Mara, Clara, and Dykes, and said, "Tomorrow's profit has been postponed." Dykes muttered, "A pity for tomorrow." "For once," Wolf said, "I agree." And there, with the lock opened inward at last, and the false architecture stripped away, the case stood ready for its final arrangement. The murderer had confessed enough to be caught, but Wolf, who prefers completion to applause, was not yet through. The duplicate creed had taken still had to be recovered, and a room full of people still needed to hear the whole truth, assembled cleanly. That, in Nero Wolf's world, is not arrest. It is conclusion. Chapter 10. When the street answered back by sunrise, Creed's confession moved through the city faster than rainwater, through cracked gutters. He had killed Elias before the ledger could be delivered, then used the false calls to keep Elias alive long enough to carry blame for the archive theft and vanish as a convenient traitor. Mara received the real last message at last. Elias had not meant to run, only to reveal what lay beneath the street and the men standing on it. Wolf lit a cigarette beneath the same humming lamp and watched Riddle Street wake like a guilty face. Because in that city, the dead do not speak, but the lies told for them always do. Nolan Creed slept downtown under arrangements less polished than his shoes had deserved, and by 6:30, the city had begun chewing the news with eager, dirty teeth. First, the police reporters got wind of a confession tied to a redevelopment fraud. Then the municipal desks started calling one another with names from the ledger and from the archive packet. By 8 o'clock, 3 council offices had denied things no one had yet accused them of, which is as close to civic music as New York often gets. At the brownstone on West 35th Street. However, the morning began correctly. Fritz served breakfast in the dining room with his usual air of defending civilization from haste. Wolf had sausage, eggs, and hot chocolate, because even after homicide and confession, he considers breakfast too serious to be modified by melodrama. I had coffee and toast, and the agreeable fatigue that follows a case when it has finally stopped expanding and agreed to behave. Wolf said little through the meal. He seldom does when the answer is complete, and the city is only now catching up to it. There is no satisfaction in repetition for him unless someone else requires it and is willing to pay. But when we had moved into the office afterward, and the first calls began, Kramer, a newspaper man, Saul Panzer checking on 2 names from the ledger, and then a district attorney's aide with gratitude too formal to be heartfelt. Wolf at last put down the receiver and grunted. "That should do," he said. "For New York?" I asked. "Never, for this morning." He closed his eyes then, not to sleep, but to refuse the century for a moment. Clara Tebbett had gone home under police attention. She neither wanted nor could avoid. Stephen Loring had gone to discover how much of his father's legacy was memory, and how much was stain. Louis Dykes had left after midnight by taxi and scarf, carrying himself like an old actor exiting a role he had not much liked, but meant to describe later, with elegance. Paul Fenwick had gone under his own steam and without handcuffs, which annoyed Kramer and pleased Wolf, because it promised further discomfort for Fenwick in daylight. Only Mara Vane remained unfinished, because Clara Tebbett's place in the matter had at last been made plain, not lover, but trustee, widow of Edmund Tebbett, one of the old club men, and the person Elias chose as a moral backstop, if his own leverage turned against him. She arrived at 10:20, precise and pale, carrying no hat because the day was dry, and she had no intention of pretending deference to weather. Fritz showed her in. She stood by my desk and looked not at me but at Wolf. "Well?" she said. Wolf opened his eyes. "Good morning to you too. I have not come for civility." "No," he said. "You have come for your brother." She sat, but only because truth, like surgery, is better handled seated. I knew what was coming and was glad of it. Cases often end in arrest and paperwork, but this one had always required something else, not merely the naming of a murderer, but the correction of a dead man's final posture in the minds of the living. Creed had tried to make Elias Vane appear a blackmailer, panicking into theft and flight. Enough of that was true to be dangerous. Enough was false to matter. Wolf folded his hands over his middle and regarded Mara Vane with the calm of a magistrate who has no court and prefers it that way. Your brother, he said, was vain, secretive, exact, and morally untidy in the way many intelligent men are when they discover corruption larger than themselves. He intended leverage before exposure. That is true, but he also intended duplication, delivery, and eventual exposure once the proof was secure and beyond a single thief's reach. Her mouth tightened. I know it, yes. But it is not all. He also intended proof, more importantly, he intended delivery. She looked at him sharply. To whom? Several possibilities, Mr. Loring, because public law can become useful when cornered. Mrs. Tebbit, because as Edmund Tebbit's widow, she knew the old club names without belonging to their current filth, and because Elias trusted her with what he could not yet publish. Possibly one newspaperman later, once duplication was secure. That is why he made the notes he did, and why he wrote in the tunnel parcel, one original, one copy to tea if necessary. He did not mean to run, Miss Vane. He meant to force revelation on terms he could survive. She sat perfectly still. You are certain? Yes. How? Wolf nodded toward me. I opened the small envelope from the safe and took out the folded page we had found after midnight in the second desk search of the shop's upstairs room, tucked inside a detective novel where Elias had hidden it badly enough to be discovered only when no one any longer looked for what was obvious. It was written in Elias's cramped, dry hand. I handed it to Mara. She read it standing still, except for the movement of her eyes. If I am delayed, tell no one I ran. The street itself is the proof, under it, and in the papers tied to it. Show T first if she has courage, then L if he has less fear than his father. No noise without copy, there it was. Not eloquent, not sentimental, not fit for framing. Elias Vane, in 3 hard lines, had answered the lie told for him. Mara read it again, then a third time, more slowly. I told you, she said, without looking up. He was not cold. Wolf grunted. I never said he was cold. I said he was exact. She lowered the page. Creed said Elias meant to use the ledger. Yes, Wolf said. He did. Men are seldom pure enough to satisfy either mourning or law. He meant to use it, and he also meant to expose it. Those motives are not contradictory, they are merely human. That was the best answer available, which is another way of saying it was the true one. She nodded once, folded the page carefully, and asked, May I keep this? Yes, Wolf said. But not the original until Kramer is done making copies. He may be vulgar, but he is correct about chain of custody. That earned him the smallest flicker of a smile from her, and because it was the first I had seen on her face, I marked it. She rose. Thank you. Wolf waved a hand. Do not be grateful. Gratitude clogs the air. She turned to go, stopped, and looked back at him. My brother admired you. He said, you disliked fools in a way he found sustaining. Your brother, Wolf said, had 1 or 2 redeeming tastes. When she had gone, I sat back and let out breath. Well, I said. Yes, Wolf said. That was almost tender. Number? Not from you. From the case. He opened one eye. Archie, your occasional capacity for accuracy is among your least attractive qualities. By noon the whole business had spread properly, and the last mechanical question had settled too. Creed, not Fenwick, had supplied the voice after midnight, coached by wax fragments and protected by distance, bad telephone lines, and listeners primed to believe Elias still alive. Reporters were pestering city offices. Halcyon Urban Renewal had suspended 2 announcements and denied knowing why. Fenwick's lawyers were awake and inflamed. Archive clerks were being interviewed by men who considered paper trails a blood sport. Kramer telephoned 3 times, once to curse a councilman, once to ask whether Wolf had truly never trusted Creed, and once to say that Creed had now improved his confession by trying to distribute responsibility among the rich and the frightened, which is exactly what Wolf had predicted he would do. Did he name Fenwick directly? Wolf asked. Enough, Kramer said. Not enough for me. Enough for the grand jury to start sharpening pencils. Good. You could sound a little happier. Number Wolf hung up and frowned at the silent receiver, as if it had offended grammar. In the middle of the afternoon, after lunch and before Wolf's return to the plant rooms, Paul Fenwick came. He had the look of a man who had slept badly and spent the morning buying advice wholesale. His tie was correct, his coat excellent, his face under strain. He declined to sit until Wolf looked at him so long that remaining upright would have become a statement. "I came," Fenwick said, "because I understand that if there is anything more to be said, it had better be said where it can be weighed properly." "That," Wolf said, "is almost sensible. Sit down." Fenwick sat. He denied murder, admitted greed in the broad civic form, admitted knowledge of the East. Block deal, denied prior knowledge of Creed's intention to kill, and confessed at last that he had indeed wanted Elias delayed, quieted, discouraged, bought, or discredited. Anything short of the shooting Creed had accomplished for him. And then beyond him, Wolf listened with a face made of patient brick. When Fenwick had finished, Wolf said, "You are fortunate, Mr. Fenwick, that murder requires a clearer hand than moral rot. Kramer will take what he can from the ledger and the transfers. He may yet find enough to vex you richly." Fenwick rose. "You are a remarkably disagreeable man." Wolf nodded. "Yes. And yet people trust you." "No," Wolf said. "They merely run out of better evasions." After Fenwick left, I said, "He wanted tomorrow too." "Yes, but Creed needed it more." "Yes. That's the whole story then." Wolf's eyes closed. "It is the whole story often enough. Several men desire profit. One has patience, one has reach, one has vanity, and one has fear. Then a dead man becomes convenient. Late in the day, with the light thinning over the street and the office growing gold around the edges, as it always does before evening, I found myself thinking again of Riddle Street in the rain on the first night. The street lamp humming, the shop dark, the dead printer talking through borrowed pauses. Cases don't often return neatly to their beginnings, but this one wanted it. So after dinner, while Wolf was in the office with beer and I had no pressing duty except loyalty, I said, "Come on." He opened one eye. "Where?" "Riddle Street." "Number, yes." "Number, you've been out twice already." A third trip would complete a historical outrage. He glared, then, to my astonishment, and perhaps his own, he rose. "You are an intolerable man," he said. "I know." We drove downtown in the sedan with the city washed clean only on the surface. By the time we reached Riddle Street, the shops were mostly shut, and the block had resumed the look it wore best, weary, watchful, and not quite able to hide what it had seen. The street lamp over Blackbriar Print still hummed faintly, as if electricity itself disapproved of old fraud in commercial districts. We got out. Wolf stood under the lamp, hands in his overcoat pockets, hat brim low, thick shoulders filling the night. The shop front was dark now, and likely to stay that way for a while. Across the street, a window lit and went dark again. Somewhere a truck shifted gears, somewhere else a radio muttered through a wall. New York does not honor the dead. It merely flows around them until paperwork intervenes. I lit a cigarette and offered him one. He took it, which was rare enough to deserve memory. I lit it for him. For a while we said nothing. There are silences with Wolf that are labor, and silences that are earned. This was the second kind. At last I said, "Elias got what he wanted." "No," Wolf said. "He got murder. Afterwards he got partial vindication. Those are not the same." He meant the street to answer. "Yes, and it did." He drew on the cigarette and let the smoke out slowly. The lamp buzzed above us. Down the block rainwater from some late washing ran along the gutter in a narrow silver line. "In New York," he said, "truth is usually buried under paper, greed, and noise. Occasionally one of them slips. That's cheerful. It is exact." We stood there another minute, looking at the dark front of the shop where Elias Vane had worked, schemed, printed, concealed, discovered, and finally died. Under the street lay the tunnel, the shelf marks, the old rails, and the proof. Above it lay the block, the buildings, the men who had hoped to own tomorrow by falsifying notices, buying signatures, and treating tenants like debris. Creed had thought he could make Elias convenient. That had been his chief mistake. He managed the dead man's voice, the locks, the archive trail, even the witnesses for an hour or two. But he could not manage the thing Elias had actually found. Not merely old scandal, but the habit of fraud built into the city like old pipework. Once that surfaced, it began doing what truth in cities does when finally disturbed. It leaked everywhere. He looked at Wolf. He had finished the cigarette and was watching the street with his face set in that expression. I know well, not satisfaction exactly, but the absence of irritation, for Wolf, that is nearly joy. Well, I said. Yes, the dead don't speak, number but lies told for them do. He turned his head and looked at me. That is nearly tolerable. Archie. From him, under a humming street lamp on Riddle Street at the end of a case. It counted as applause. We got back in the sedan and drove uptown through a city already busy manufacturing. Tomorrow's lies, but one set had been answered. The shop was dark, the tunnel opened, the ledger copied, the fraud broken into daylight, and Elias Vane's last message finally delivered where it belonged. Not to the police, not to the newspapers, not to men like Creed or Fenwick, but to the one person who needed to know he had not run. That was enough. Not for justice in the large civic sense. New York never grants enough of that. But for the story, for Wolf, and for me, it was enough, and that is how Riddle Street answered back.